The November wind cut through Ruby Creek like a knife sharp and unforgiving. Frost clung to the brittle grass, turning the Montana landscape into a canvas of silver and white. Eleanor Nora Haywood pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she knelt beside the simple wooden cross that marked her husband's grave. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. 2 years today, Samuel, she whispered, placing a dried wildflower she'd found beneath the snow onto the frozen ground. I'm still keeping my promise. The flower, once vibrant purple, now faded to a dusty lavender, seemed a fitting symbol of her life since Samuel's death. Still standing but withered by circumstance and the harsh realities of survival. She traced her gloved finger over the roughly carved letters of his name. The tractor broke down again yesterday. Jacob tried to fix it himself. A sad smile crossed her face. He's so determined to be the man of the house, just like you were at his age. In the distance, the sun struggled to break through heavy clouds, casting weak light over the rolling hills and the small ranch Samuel had built with his own hands. Their dream, their future. Now her burden alone. The banks pressing harder. Blackwood came by last week. Her voice caught. I don't know how much longer I can hold them off. The sound of an approaching carriage interrupted her quiet communion with the dead. Nora turned to see a sleek black carriage pulled by two matching bay horses coming up the path toward her homestead. Even without seeing the driver, she knew who it was. Garrett Blackwood never missed an opportunity to remind her of her precarious position. She watched as the carriage stopped at her front gate. Blackwood stepped down, his tailored coat and polished boots, a stark contrast to the rugged surroundings. He didn't approach the small family cemetery on the hill, merely stood by the fence, surveying the property with the calculating gaze of a man already counting his profits. Nora pressed her palm against the cold earth of Samuel's grave. I promised you I'd keep this place for Jacob, that I wouldn't let anyone take what we built. Her voice hardened. I'll find a way, Samuel, whatever it takes. She rose, brushing dirt from her skirt, and started down the hill toward the inevitable confrontation. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself were trying to hold her back to keep her safe in the shelter of grief, rather than thrust her into the battlefield of survival. Garrett Blackwood was examining her barn door when Nora approached, his leather-gloved hand running along the weathered wood as if assessing its value. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Haywood, he said, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy, I apologize for interrupting your reflection. Mr. Blackwood. Nora kept her voice neutral, refusing to show the anxiety his presence provoked. What brings you out this way? Just checking on my investments. He gestured broadly at the ranch. This has been a difficult year for many in Ruby Creek. Failed crops, harsh weather. His gaze settled on her face. Mounting debts. The implied threat hung between them like frost in the air. My payments aren't due until the first of the month, Nora said, straightening her spine. You'll have them. Blackwood chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. Mrs. Haywood, Nora, we both know this situation has become untenable. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore. A woman alone simply cannot manage a property of this size, especially with a young boy to raise. I've managed for 2 years. Have you? His eyebrow raised in a perfect arch of condescension. The fences are falling into disrepair. Your cattle herd is half what it was when Samuel was alive, and the bank ledgers show mounting debt, not progress. Each observation struck like a physical blow, accurate and painful. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks, but refused to lower her gaze. What is it you want, Mr. Blackwood? I doubt you rode all this way to discuss my bookkeeping. He smiled again, this time with a hint of genuine amusement. Direct as always, it's one of your more admirable qualities. He adjusted his gloves, taking his time before continuing. The bank's board of directors has reviewed your case. Given the amount owed and the lack of, shall we say, proper management, they've authorized foreclosure proceedings. The world seemed to tilt beneath Nora's feet. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them devastatingly real. When, the single word was all she could manage. After Christmas. He delivered the sentences casually, as if discussing the weather. December 25th, to be precise. 25 days from now. That's not enough time. It's more than generous considering the circumstances. Blackwood interrupted smoothly. However, I've taken the liberty of proposing an alternative solution to the board. Nora felt a cold dread settle in her stomach knowing what was coming before he spoke the words. Marriage, Blackwood said, watching her face carefully. A business arrangement, if you will. I need a wife of good standing to solidify my position in the community. You need to keep this ranch for your son. He gestured to the property around them. Nothing would change, really. You would continue to live here, manage the household as you see fit. I would handle the financial matters, make the necessary improvements to return the ranch to profitability. And in return, Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood's smile widened a fraction. In return, you would fulfill the social obligations expected of a banker's wife. Host dinner parties, attend church functions, present a respectable face to the community. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. And of course, provide the comforts of a proper home. The implication was unmistakable. Nora fought the urge to step back, to retreat from this man who spoke of her future as if it were a commodity to be bartered. I'll need time to consider your proposal. Of course, he nodded magnanimously. Until Christmas, then. Though I would advise not waiting until the last minute. Arrangements would need to be made, paperwork filed. He paused, his expression hardening slightly. And Nora, I should mention, I've purchased all your outstanding debts from various creditors in town. Everything is consolidated now under my authority alone. The message was clear: there would be no appealing to other, perhaps more sympathetic lenders. Blackwood had ensured he was her only option. Good day, Mrs. Haywood. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and do give young Jacob my regards. A boy needs a father's guidance, especially at his age. I look forward to providing that guidance, one way or another. As his carriage pulled away, Nora remained rooted to the spot, the cold seeping through her worn boots and into her bones. 25 days. 25 days to decide between losing everything Samuel had built or binding herself to a man whose very presence made her feel unclean. She walked slowly to the porch, sank onto the wooden steps, and pulled Samuel's old coat around her shoulders. From a pocket, she withdrew a small leather journal, Samuel's ledger, where he'd kept meticulous records of every penny spent and earned. She tore out a page covered in red figures and crumpled it in her fist. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the woman she had been before, a school teacher with dreams of independence, who had fallen in love with Samuel's kind eyes and grand visions of a life built with their own hands. She had traded chalk dust for cattle primers, for fence posts, believing in the future they would create together. I've fought for 2 years, she whispered to the empty yard, just to hand it all over to another man. I told you I could do it myself. Jacob Haywood's frustrated voice carried across the barnyard as he struggled with a bucket of feed that was clearly too heavy for his 10-year-old frame. The wooden handle dug into his palms as he staggered forward, determination etched on his young face. Nora watched from the kitchen window, her heart aching. Jacob had Samuel's stubborn chin and the same set to his shoulders when faced with a challenge. Since his father's death, he had appointed himself the man of the house, taking on tasks far beyond his years and abilities. Jacob, she called, stepping onto the porch. Let me help you with that. I've got it. His voice strained with effort as the bucket tilted, spilling some of the feed onto the frozen ground. Frustration flashed across his face, followed immediately by a look of dejection that cut Nora to the quick. She crossed the yard, careful not to move too quickly. Jacob's pride was as fragile as it was fierce these days. Here, she said gently, taking hold of one side of the bucket. We'll do it together. For a moment he resisted, then relented with a sigh that seemed too heavy for his small body. Together they carried the feed to the trough where their few remaining cattle waited. I should be able to do it alone, Jacob muttered, not meeting her eyes. Pa could carry 2 buckets at once. Your father was a grown man, Nora reminded him, ruffling his hair. You're growing stronger every day, but these things take time. Jacob kicked at the frozen dirt. We don't have time. I heard what Mr. Blackwood said last week about the money we owe. Nora felt a pang of guilt. She had tried to shield Jacob from their financial troubles, but the boy was observant and quick-witted, a combination that made secrets difficult to keep. Mr. Blackwood has offered to help us, she said carefully, not ready to explain the full nature of that help. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. You're not going to marry him, are you? Like Mrs. Peterson did with Mr. Collins after her husband died? The directness of the question caught Nora off guard. I, I'm considering all our options, Jacob. We don't need his help, Jacob's voice rose with passion. I can work harder. I can quit school and work full-time on the ranch. I'll make money to save Pa's land. I don't want a new father. The raw emotion in his voice nearly broke Nora's resolve. She knelt down, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirt, and took Jacob's hands in hers. Listen to me, she said firmly. Your father wanted you to get an education. That's not negotiable. And this isn't just about money or land, Jacob. It's about your future. My future is here, he insisted, gesturing around them. Pa built this place for us. He wouldn't want some banker living in his house, sleeping in his bed, trying to be my father. The truth of his words pierced Nora's heart. Samuel would indeed hate the thought of Garrett Blackwood taking his place in his home and in his family. But what choice did they have? I need you to trust me, she said finally. Whatever happens, whatever decisions I make, they will be for us, for our family. Jacob's eyes, so like his father's, searched her face. Promise you won't marry him, Ma. Please. Before Nora could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. But it wasn't Blackwood's fancy carriage returning. Instead, a single rider on a sturdy brown horse made his way down the path to their ranch. The man was large, tall, and broad-shouldered, with a full beard that partially obscured his face. He wore simple, worn clothing that had seen better days, and his hat was pulled low against the cold. Who's that? Jacob asked, squinting against the weak winter sunlight. Nora recognized the rider with a mixture of surprise and unease. That's Daniel Sullivan, she said quietly. Some folks call him Simple Sullivan. Why, Bohm? Because people in town think he's... She paused, searching for a kind way to explain. They think his mind works differently than most. He doesn't talk much, keeps to himself mostly. Sullivan stopped his horse at a respectful distance, dismounting with surprising grace for such a large man. He stood for a moment, seemingly uncertain, before approaching with slow, deliberate steps. Mrs. Haywood, he said, his voice low and slightly rough, as if unused to speaking, saw your wagon wheels broke, near the creek. The words came out halting, each one appearing to require conscious effort. Nora felt a flicker of alarm. She had indeed broken a wheel on the far side of the property 2 days ago, but had told no one. How did you know about that? Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. I pass by sometimes. On my way to town. He gestured vaguely eastward. Saw the wagon. Thought maybe I could help fix it. Jacob moved closer to Nora, eyeing the stranger with the wariness of a child who had already lost one parent and feared losing another. That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan, Nora said carefully, but we couldn't impose no imposition. Sullivan shook his head. Got tools. Got time. He pointed to a leather satchel hanging from his saddle. Nora hesitated. The broken wagon was a serious problem. Without it, she couldn't transport goods to town or bring back supplies. Hiring someone to fix it would cost money she didn't have, and attempting the repair herself had proven beyond her abilities. I can help too, Jacob interjected, suddenly stepping forward with his chin thrust out. I'm strong. I can hold things steady while you work. Sullivan turned his gaze to the boy, studying him with an intensity that might have seemed threatening, if not for the gentleness in his eyes. Good to have help, he said, finally offering a small nod that seemed to acknowledge Jacob's need to contribute. All right then, Nora decided, still uncertain but seeing few alternatives. The wagon's down by Miller's Creek, about a half-mile east. Jacob can show you the way while I finish the morning chores. As the pair headed off, Jacob walking quickly to keep pace with Sullivan's long strides, Nora couldn't help but worry. Ruby Creek was a small town, and Daniel Sullivan was something of a mystery. He'd appeared about a year ago, taking odd jobs and keeping to himself. People called him simple because of his halting speech and apparent difficulty with social interaction, but something about him had always struck Nora as deliberate, as if his awkwardness were a choice rather than a condition. Still, what choice did she have? The wagon needed fixing, and Sullivan was offering free labor. In her position, pride was a luxury she could ill afford. When Nora finished the chores and made her way to the creek, she was surprised by the scene that greeted her. The wagon was already propped up safely, the broken wheel removed. But it wasn't the progress on the repair that caught her attention, it was Jacob. Her normally frustrated, often angry son was sitting cross-legged on the ground arranging Sullivan's tools in some kind of pattern. His face showed concentration rather than the scowl that had become his default expression in recent months. See if you organize them by size, not just by type. Jacob was explaining, you can find what you need faster. Sullivan, kneeling beside the wagon, nodded thoughtfully. Smart system, he said, his voice still halting, but somehow warmer than before. Your idea, Jacob beamed with pride. Pa taught me. He said a man who can't find his tools wastes half his day looking for them. Wise man, Sullivan agreed, selecting a wrench from Jacob's carefully arranged display. Neither had noticed Nora's approach, and she hesitated to interrupt this unexpected moment of connection. It had been so long since she'd seen Jacob engage with anyone this way, with interest rather than defensiveness, with enthusiasm rather than obligation. How's it coming along? She asked, finally making her presence known. Both males looked up Jacob with excitement, Sullivan with a quick, almost wary glance before returning his attention to the wagon. Mr. Sullivan says the axle isn't broken, just the wheel, Jacob reported. He can fix it today, and he's showing me how so I can do it myself next time. Sullivan ducked his head slightly as if embarrassed by the praise. Not difficult, he murmured. Just need right tools. Nora studied the large man as he worked. Up close, she could see that, despite his rough appearance, his hands moved with surprising precision. There was nothing clumsy or simple about the way he manipulated the tools, making minute adjustments with a craftsman's care. Mr. Sullivan, we're grateful for your help, but I insist on offering you something in return, Nora said. Perhaps dinner. It'll be simple fare, but hot and plentiful. Sullivan glanced up briefly, something like surprise flickering across his bearded face. No need, he said, returning to his work. Helping is enough. Jacob looked disappointed. But Mom makes the best rabbit stew in Ruby Creek. Even Pa said so. A ghost of a smile crossed Sullivan's face. Well then, he said slowly, be rude to refuse. By mid-afternoon, the wagon was repaired, its wheel not just functional, but somehow sturdier than before. Sullivan had reinforced the weakened sections with metal bands he'd brought in his satchel, explaining to Jacob in simple terms the principles of load distribution and tension. As they walked back to the house, Jacob bombarded Sullivan with questions about tools, repairs, and a dozen other practical matters. To Nora's surprise, Sullivan answered each one patiently, his halting speech becoming slightly more fluid as he explained concepts that clearly interested him. In the kitchen, as Nora prepared to reheat the promised stew, she watched through the window as Sullivan showed Jacob how to properly care for the tools before putting them away. Oil prevents rust, he was saying, demonstrating the proper way to wipe down a wrench. Rust is like a sickness for metal, makes it weak. Jacob nodded solemnly, taking the wrench and mimicking Sullivan's motions with exaggerated care. Is that why some of Pa's old tools don't work as well anymore? Because they got sick with rust? Might be, Sullivan agreed. Could look at them sometime, see if they can be healed. The choice of words struck Nora as odd for a man supposedly limited in his understanding. Healing was not a term typically applied to inanimate objects. Yet Sullivan had used it purposefully, connecting with Jacob's understanding of illness and recovery. When they came inside for dinner, Sullivan removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair streaked with premature gray. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if uncertain of his welcome despite the invitation. Please sit down. Nora gestured to the simple wooden table. Jacob, would you fetch the bread from the pantry? As her son hurried off, Sullivan took a seat, his large frame making the sturdy chair seem almost delicate by comparison. His eyes, a deep blue that contrasted sharply with his weathered face, took in the modest kitchen with what appeared to be appreciation rather than judgment. Nice home, he said quietly. Feels lived in, loved. The simple observation caught Nora off guard. Most visitors either pitied their modest circumstances or, like Blackwood, assessed everything in terms of monetary value. Sullivan seemed to see something different, something more fundamental. Thank you, she replied, ladling stew into bowls. Samuel built most of it himself. We added on as we could afford to. Sullivan nodded, accepting the bowl she placed before him. Good craftsmanship, built to last. They ate mostly in silence, broken only by Jacob's occasional questions and Sullivan's brief but thoughtful answers. Nora noticed that despite his size, Sullivan ate with surprising delicacy, and though his speech remained halting, he never spoke with his mouth full or mishandled his utensils. Small details, perhaps, but not ones typically associated with a man of limited mental capacity. As the meal concluded, Jacob looked up from his empty bowl with hopeful eyes. "Ma, can Mr. Sullivan look at Pa's old tools, the ones in the chest in the barn? He said he might be able to fix them." Before Nora could respond, Sullivan shook his head. "Getting dark," he said, glancing toward the window where twilight was indeed gathering. "Another time, maybe." Jacob's face fell, but he nodded with the resignation of a child accustomed to disappointment. "Will you come back, though? You promised to show me how to fix the leather on the harness, too." Sullivan looked to Nora, clearly unwilling to make such a commitment without her permission. His deference to her authority in her own home was yet another detail that didn't align with the simple label the town had given him. "Mr. Sullivan is welcome to return whenever it's convenient." Nora found herself saying, surprising even herself with the invitation, "We have many repairs that could benefit from your expertise." Something like gratitude flickered in Sullivan's eyes. "Could come tomorrow," he offered, "if that's acceptable." As he prepared to leave, gathering his satchel of tools, Jacob suddenly darted forward. "Wait, you forgot this." He held out a book, a small leather-bound volume that must have fallen from Sullivan's bag. Sullivan's reaction was immediate and alarming. His face paled beneath his tan, and he snatched the book with uncharacteristic haste, shoving it deep into his pocket. "Thank you," he muttered, not meeting either of their eyes. But not before Nora had glimpsed the title embossed in faded gold on the spine, Meditations, by Marcus Aurelius. Not in English, but in what appeared to be the original Latin. A strange choice of reading material for a supposedly simple man. After Sullivan had ridden away, promising to return the next day, Jacob turned to Nora with excitement she hadn't seen in months. "I like him," he declared. "He doesn't treat me like a baby. And he knows lots of things, Ma. Not just about tools, but about stars and weather and animals, too. He told me how to tell when a storm's coming by watching the cattle." Nora smiled, grateful for her son's happiness, even as questions about their unusual visitor multiplied in her mind. "He seems very knowledgeable," she agreed. "Do you think he's really simple, like people say?" Jacob asked, his perceptiveness once again catching her off guard. Nora considered her answer carefully. "I think people are often more complicated than the labels we give them," she said finally. "Mr. Sullivan might be different in some ways, but that doesn't mean he's lacking in others." Jacob nodded, seeming satisfied with this explanation. "Can I show him Pa's tools tomorrow? I bet he could fix the broken plane." "Yes," Nora agreed, making a mental note to examine the Latin book more closely if given the opportunity. "But for now, it's time for your reading lesson." As they settled by the fire with one of the few books they owned, a collection of folk tales Samuel had purchased years ago, Nora found her thoughts returning to Daniel Sullivan and the mystery he presented. A man who spoke haltingly but read Latin philosophy, who appeared awkward in social situations, yet connected effortlessly with a grieving 10-year-old boy, who the town dismissed as simple, but who demonstrated skills and knowledge that suggested a very different reality. And more pressingly, why would such a man hide his true capabilities behind a facade of limitation? Mom. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where the sky seems impossibly blue against the white landscape. Nora dressed with extra care, selecting her best dress, a navy blue wool, that had once been stylish, but now showed careful mending at the seams. Church was not just a religious obligation in Ruby Creek. It was the center of social life, the place where news was exchanged, deals were made, and reputations were assessed. "I don't see why I have to wear this," Jacob complained, tugging at the stiff collar of his Sunday shirt. "It itches." "Because it's respectful," Nora replied automatically, straightening his collar for the third time. "And because Mrs. Jenkins gave it to you, and she'll want to see you wearing it." The mention of Florence Jenkins, the wealthiest and most influential woman in Ruby Creek, had the desired effect. Jacob stopped fidgeting, though his expression remained mutinous. "Will Mr. Sullivan be at church?" he asked as they climbed into the newly repaired wagon. "I don't know," Nora answered truthfully. "I've never seen him there." "Maybe he goes to a different church," Jacob suggested. "Or maybe he prays alone. Pa said God hears you wherever you are." Nora smiled at her son's attempt to explain Sullivan's absence. "Your father was right about that." The church was already filling when they arrived, families greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a small community. Nora noticed the subtle shift in demeanor as she approached conversations, pausing momentarily, eyes flickering toward her with curiosity or pity, or sometimes a less charitable emotion. 2 years as a widow had taught her to recognize the gradations of social acceptance. While no one in Ruby Creek was openly cruel, there was a distinct difference between the genuine welcome extended to proper families and the careful courtesy offered to a woman in her position. Nora, darling, Florence Jenkins materialized beside her, resplendent in a burgundy dress that must have cost more than Nora earned in a year. How lovely to see you. And Jacob, how you've grown. Florence was in her 50s, a widow herself, though her late husband's railroad investments had left her comfortably wealthy rather than precariously independent. She ruled Ruby Creek's social circles with a velvet-gloved iron hand, her opinions shaping the community's collective judgment more effectively than any law. Florence, Nora nodded politely. Thank you again for the shirt. Jacob is very grateful, aren't you, Jacob? Her son mumbled something, approximating gratitude, his eyes fixed on his shoes. Think nothing of it. Florence waved a jeweled hand dismissively. My nephew has outgrown so many things, and with no younger boys in the family, they just go to waste. Her voice lowered confidentially. I heard Garrett Blackwood paid you a visit yesterday. Such a fine man, so established in the community. The speed with which news traveled in Ruby Creek never failed to astonish Nora. Mr. Blackwood had some business to discuss, she said neutrally. Florence's eyes gleamed with the light of someone who already knew more than she should. Business, of course, though I understand the nature of that business might bring a welcome change to your situation. She glanced meaningfully at Jacob. A boy needs a father's guidance, especially at his age. Before Nora could formulate a response that wouldn't involve words unsuitable for church, the bell rang, signaling the start of the service. She guided Jacob to a pew near the back, feeling Florence's speculative gaze follow them. Pastor Wilson, a tall man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had survived his share of Montana winters, took his place at the pulpit. His sermon that day, perhaps by coincidence or perhaps by Florence Jenkins's suggestion, focused on the proper roles of men and women in a godly community. The Lord in his wisdom, Pastor Wilson intoned, has ordained that men shall provide and protect, while women shall nurture and support. When these divine roles are respected, the community prospers. When they are defied, his gaze seemed to settle briefly on Nora. Hardship follows not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of working against God's design. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks, aware of the sidelong glances directed her way. She fixed her eyes on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church, trying to find comfort in the faith that had sustained her through the darkest days after Samuel's death. But today the familiar words and rituals offered little solace. Instead, she found herself wondering what Samuel would think of this sermon. Samuel, who had encouraged her to learn bookkeeping and cattle management alongside him who had valued her mind as much as her housekeeping skills. When the service concluded, Nora planned a swift exit, but found her path blocked by well-meaning congregants, with thinly veiled curiosity about her business with Garrett Blackwood. Such a fine man. Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly, the woman who had indeed married Mr. Collins 6 months after her husband's death. So established, so respected. And generous too, added Mr. Roberts, the general store owner, who had extended credit to Nora more than once. Why, just last month he forgave a debt owed by the widow Matthews when she found herself unable to pay. The implication was clear: Blackwood could be merciful if one accepted his terms. Nora murmured non-committal responses, keenly aware of Jacob's presence at her side, absorbing every word, every nuance of these adult conversations. Finally breaking free, they were halfway to their wagon when Garrett Blackwood himself appeared, immaculately dressed in a black suit that emphasized his position as one of Ruby Creek's most prosperous citizens. Mrs. Haywood, he smiled, tipping his hat. Young Jacob, a fine sermon today, wasn't it? Very instructive, Nora replied, keeping her tone neutral. Indeed. Blackwood's eyes held a knowing gleam. Pastor Wilson has a gift for illuminating the natural order of things. He turned his attention to Jacob. And how are you finding school, young man? I understand from Miss Abernathy that you have quite a talent for mathematics. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. It's all right, he mumbled. More than all right from what I hear, Blackwood pressed. Such skills will serve you well in the future. With proper guidance, you might even follow in my footsteps one day. Banking is a respectable profession, secure and well-regarded. The possessive presumption in his words, the casual assumption that he would have a say in Jacob's future, sent a chill through Nora that had nothing to do with the winter air. Jacob's future is still being written, she said firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have chores waiting at home. Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. Of course, though I hope we might continue our discussion soon. The matter we spoke of yesterday requires a timely decision. As they drove home, Jacob remained unusually quiet, staring at the passing landscape with a pensive expression that made him look older than his years. What's wrong? Nora asked finally, unable to bear the silence. Everyone wants you to marry Mr. Blackwood, Jacob said flatly. They all think it's already decided. Nora sighed, choosing her words carefully. People in small towns like to speculate, Jacob. It doesn't mean anything is decided. But you're thinking about it, aren't you? He turned to face her, his young face tight with anxiety. Because of the money, because of the ranch. I'm considering all our options, she said honestly. Mr. Blackwood's offer is one of them, yes. I hate him, Jacob declared with sudden vehemence. He looks at our home like he already owns it, like he already owns us. The raw truth in her son's assessment struck Nora forcefully. Blackwood did indeed regard them as possessions to be acquired rather than people to be cared for. The realization strengthened a resolve that had been forming since their conversation by Samuel's grave. I promise you this, she said, taking one hand from the reins to squeeze Jacob's smaller one. Whatever decision I make, it will be for our benefit, not his, and I will never ever let anyone own us. As their wagon crested the hill overlooking their modest ranch, Nora was surprised to see a familiar figure waiting by the barn. Daniel Sullivan sat on a fallen log, seemingly content to wait however long their church visit might take. Jacob's face lit up at the sight. He came back, just like he promised. The transformation in her son's demeanor was remarkable, from brooding anxiety to excited anticipation in the space of a heartbeat. Whatever else might be said about Daniel Sullivan, his effect on Jacob was undeniably positive. As they approached, Sullivan stood removing his hat respectfully. Hope it's not too early, he said, his speech still measured and deliberate. Brought some things, for the tools. Jacob leapt from the wagon almost before it stopped. You remembered Ma said you could look at Pa's tools. They're in a chest in the barn. Sullivan glanced at Nora, seeking confirmation of this permission. When she nodded, a small smile crossed his bearded face. Not the practiced social expression Blackwood deployed so effectively, but something genuine that reached his eyes. Need to change first, Nora told Jacob, nodding toward her good dress. Why don't you show Mr. Sullivan the tools while I get into something more suitable for barn work? As she entered the house, Nora caught a glimpse through the window of Jacob practically dragging Sullivan toward the barn, chattering excitedly. The contrast between this interaction and Jacob's subdued demeanor around Garrett Blackwood could not have been more stark. In her bedroom, as she changed from her Sunday best into a practical work dress, Nora found herself studying her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. At 35, she was still a handsome woman, though the past 2 years had etched fine lines around her eyes and threaded silver through her dark hair. What would you do, Samuel? She asked the empty room. Fight to keep our dream alive at any cost, or recognize when it's time to let go. The mirror offered no answers, only the reflection of a woman at a crossroads with 24 days remaining to choose her path. Outside, the sound of male laughter, one high and young one deep and resonant, drifted from the barn. Nora moved to the window and saw Sullivan demonstrating something to Jacob. Both of them bent over the workbench with identical expressions of concentration. It struck her then with unexpected force that this was what Jacob had been missing. Not just a father's authority or provision, but a father's companionship. The simple joy of learning and doing alongside someone who valued his contribution. For the first time since Blackwood's ultimatum, Nora felt something beyond anxiety and resignation. A small spark of defiance, perhaps, or the first stirrings of an alternative she hadn't yet fully imagined. Whatever it was, it carried her out of the house and toward the barn with a lighter step than she'd managed in months. Inside, she found Jacob proudly polishing a hand plane, while Sullivan examined the cutting edge with expert attention. Just needed cleaning and sharpening, Sullivan explained, looking up as she entered. Good tool. Will last generations if cared for. Like Mr. Sullivan showed me, Jacob added eagerly. He says tools are like people, they work best when they're respected and taken care of properly. Nora raised an eyebrow at this philosophical observation so at odds with Sullivan's supposed simplicity. That's very insightful, Mr. Sullivan. A faint flush colored his weathered cheeks. Just practical, he muttered, returning his attention to the tool in his hands. For the next few hours, the three of them worked together, sorting, cleaning, and repairing Samuel's old tools. Sullivan proved to be not just knowledgeable but patient, explaining each step to Jacob in terms the boy could understand while demonstrating a craftsman's skill that spoke of years of experience. As the afternoon waned, Jacob grew increasingly animated, proudly showing Nora each restored tool and explaining its purpose and proper care with the authority of a newly minted expert. "And Mr. Sullivan says I can help him fix the barn door tomorrow," he announced, practically bouncing with excitement. "He says it's hanging wrong because the top hinge is bent and we can straighten it with the right leverage." Nora glanced at Sullivan, who ducked his head in that now familiar gesture of mild embarrassment. "If that's acceptable," he said quietly. "Noticed it needs fixing. Have the materials." "That's very generous of you," Nora replied, genuinely touched by his continued willingness to help. "But I can't keep accepting your labor without proper compensation." Sullivan shook his head. "Don't need money." "Then at least join us for dinner again," she insisted. "It's the least I can offer." This time Sullivan accepted without hesitation, following them to the house with the comfortable familiarity of someone returning to a place where they felt welcome. During the simple meal of cornbread and beans, Jacob dominated the conversation, peppering Sullivan with questions about tools, repairs, and increasingly about the wider world beyond Ruby Creek. "Have you ever been to New York City?" Jacob asked between bites. "My friend Billy's uncle went there once. He said the buildings are so tall you can't see the tops of them." Sullivan nodded, swallowing before answering. "Been there. Buildings tall as mountains. Streets full of people from everywhere." "You've traveled a lot then?" Nora asked, her curiosity about this enigmatic man growing by the hour. Sullivan seemed to consider his answer carefully. "Some," he admitted finally. "East Coast, Denver, San Francisco." "How come you settled in Ruby Creek?" Jacob asked innocently. "It's not exactly exciting compared to those places." A shadow crossed Sullivan's face. "Quiet is good," he said simply. "People leave you alone." The statement hung in the air, laden with implications Nora couldn't fully decipher. What would drive a clearly intelligent, well-traveled man to seek anonymity in a remote Montana town, and why adopt the persona of someone with limited mental capacity? As if sensing her thoughts, Sullivan changed the subject, asking Jacob about his schoolwork. The conversation shifted to safer ground, though Nora noted how Sullivan's questions subtly guided Jacob toward connecting his practical lessons from the barn with the more abstract concepts he struggled with in school. "See, measuring lumber uses fractions," Sullivan explained when Jacob mentioned his difficulties with arithmetic. "Same fractions as in your school book, just applied differently." Jacob's eyes widened with the revelation that the dreaded mathematics might actually have practical value. "Could you show me with real measuring, not just numbers on paper?" Sullivan glanced at Nora once again, seeking her approval before making any commitment to her son. When she nodded, he offered one of his rare smiles. "Tomorrow," he promised, "while we fix the door." After dinner, as twilight deepened into true darkness, Sullivan prepared to leave. Jacob, fighting sleep but determined to see his new friend off, insisted on walking him to his horse. Nora watched from the porch as the large man carefully adjusted his saddle, speaking quietly to Jacob. Whatever he said made the boy stand straighter with a newfound dignity that tugged at her heart. As Sullivan mounted his horse, Jacob turned and ran back to the house, disappearing inside without a word to Nora. Sullivan raised his hand in a brief farewell, then urged his horse toward the road. Nora remained on the porch watching until horse and rider disappeared into the darkness. So lost in thought was she that she didn't hear Jacob's return until he spoke directly beside her. "He dropped this again," Jacob said, holding out a small object. "I tried to catch him, but he was already too far away." In her son's palm lay a small book, the same leather-bound volume she had glimpsed the day before. But now in the lamplight spilling from the open door, you'd examine it properly. The title embossed in faded gold on the spine confirmed her earlier observation, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius in Latin. Opening it carefully, she found margins filled with neat annotations, also in Latin, the handwriting small but perfectly legible. Interspersed with the Latin were occasional notes in English, French, and what appeared to be Greek all in the same meticulous hand. This was not just a book owned by a scholar. It was a book studied deeply repeatedly by someone with a formidable education and command of multiple languages. "Can you read it, Ma?" Jacob asked, peering at the unfamiliar text. "No," Nora admitted, closing the book gently. "It's in Latin, classical Latin from ancient Rome." Jacob's brow furrowed. "But if Mr. Sullivan can't talk good, how can he read something so hard?" The question crystallized the mystery that had been building in Nora's mind since Sullivan's first appearance. "I don't think Mr. Sullivan has trouble talking, Jacob," she said slowly. "I think for some reason he wants people to believe he does." "But why would anyone pretend to be simple?" Jacob asked, echoing her own confusion. Nora looked down at the book in her hands, tangible evidence that Daniel Sullivan was far more than he appeared. "I don't know," she said truthfully, "but I think it's time we found out." The following morning dawned gray and cold, with heavy clouds promising snow before nightfall. Nora woke earlier than usual, her sleep disturbed by thoughts of Daniel Sullivan and the enigma he presented. The Latin book sat on her bedside table, a tangible reminder that appearances could be deceptive. She traced the embossed lettering on the spine, wondering what secrets lay behind Sullivan's carefully constructed facade. What would drive an educated man to hide his intelligence? What past could make pretending to be simple seem preferable to being himself? A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her musings. "Ma," Jacob's voice carried through the wood. "Are you awake? Mr. Sullivan might come early and I want to be ready." The excitement in her son's voice brought a smile to Nora's face despite her concerns. Whatever Sullivan's secrets might be, his effect on Jacob was undeniably positive. For the first time since Samuel's death, the boy seemed eager to face the day rather than burdened by it. "I'm awake," she called back. "Go ahead and start the morning chores. I'll be out shortly to help with breakfast." As she dressed, Nora contemplated how to approach the mystery of the book. Direct confrontation seemed unwise if Sullivan had reasons to hide his true nature. Challenging him might only drive him away. Yet the questions multiplied in her mind, demanding answers. By the time she entered the kitchen, Jacob had already lit the stove and was attempting to mix batter for flapjacks, his face screwed up in concentration as he measured flour with exaggerated care. "I want to make breakfast for Mr. Sullivan," he explained without looking up, "to thank him for fixing Pa's tools." Nora felt a pang of both pride and sorrow. Pride at her son's thoughtfulness. Sorrow that such a simple connection with a male figure could mean so much to him. "That's very considerate," she said, moving to help. "But I'm not sure Mr. Sullivan will join us for breakfast." Jacob's face fell momentarily before brightening again. "Then we'll save some for when he gets here. They'll still be good cold, won't they?" "We can always warm them up," Nora assured him, touched by his determination. They worked together, preparing the morning meal, Jacob chattering about the barn door repairs and all he hoped to learn from Sullivan. Nora listened with half an ear, her mind still occupied with the puzzle of their unusual visitor. After breakfast, as they washed the dishes, Jacob suddenly asked, "Are you going to give Mr. Sullivan his book back?" Nora hesitated, weighing her answer. "Yes," she said finally, "but I'd like to understand more about it first. It's a very special book, Jacob. Not many people can read Latin, especially not well enough to make notes in it." "Maybe he's like Clark Kent," Jacob suggested, naming the character from the comic books Samuel had occasionally brought him from town. "Pretending to be normal but secretly special." The childish comparison held more insight than Jacob could know. "Maybe," Nora agreed, "but if that's true, we need to respect his secret, don't we? At least until he chooses to share it." Jacob nodded solemnly. "I won't tell anyone he's smart," he promised. "People in town already don't like him because they think he's different. They might like him even less if they knew he was smarter than them." The observation, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, struck Nora forcefully. Jacob had identified a truth that had eluded her. In a small town like Ruby Creek, being perceived as intellectually limited might actually offer a kind of protection from scrutiny or resentment. "That's very perceptive, Jacob," she said softly, "and very kind." By mid-morning, with still no sign of Sullivan, Jacob had taken to watching the road from the front porch, his disappointment growing with each passing hour. "Maybe he forgot," he said, finally kicking at a loose board on the porch step. "Or maybe he didn't really want to come back." He might have other obligations, Nora suggested, though she too felt a twinge of disappointment. Mr. Sullivan doesn't owe us his time, Jacob. But he promised about the door, Jacob insisted, the childish petulance in his voice betraying how much he had been looking forward to Sullivan's return. Before Nora could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the direction of town. Both Haywoods turned expectantly, only to have their hopes dashed when Garrett Blackwood's elegant carriage appeared around the bend instead of Sullivan's plain brown horse. Jacob's face darkened immediately. "Why does he keep coming here?" he muttered, retreating into the house without waiting for an answer. Nora smoothed her apron and straightened her shoulders, preparing for another uncomfortable encounter with the banker. Blackwood had clearly decided to increase the pressure his second visit in as many days, sending a clear message about his determination. The carriage pulled up to the front gate, and Blackwood descended with his usual precision, every movement calculated to convey authority and control. Today, he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Haywood," he called, his voice carrying across the yard, "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood," Nora replied, the social courtesy automatic despite her inner resistance. "This is an unexpected visit." Blackwood approached, removing his hat with practiced gallantry. "I realized after church yesterday that we were interrupted before I could properly express my thoughts regarding our arrangement." He held out the parcel, a small token of my esteem. Nora hesitated before accepting the package, unwilling to create any sense of obligation, but equally unwilling to provoke Blackwood's displeasure. "That's very thoughtful," she said neutrally. "Please open it," Blackwood urged, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I selected it with great care." With reluctant fingers, Nora unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small jewelry box. Inside lay a gold brooch, not ostentatious but clearly expensive, with a small pearl set at its center. "It's lovely," she said automatically, closing the box quickly, "but I couldn't possibly accept such a valuable gift." "I insist," Blackwood said smoothly. "Consider it a gesture of my intentions. A lady in your position deserves some small luxury, and as your future husband, I intend to provide many more." The presumption in his words, the confident assertion of a future she had not agreed to, sent a chill through Nora despite the morning sun. "Mr. Blackwood, I haven't yet—" "Please call me Garrett," he interrupted, taking the jewelry box from her hands and removing the brooch. "May I—" Without waiting for permission, he stepped closer and pinned the brooch to her simple dress, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. Nora fought the urge to step back, unwilling to show the discomfort his proximity caused. "There," Blackwood said with satisfaction, "a small preview of how things will be once our arrangement is formalized. You'll find I can be quite generous to those under my care." The possessive undercurrent in his words made Nora's skin crawl. "Mr. Blackwood," she began firmly, "while I appreciate the gesture, I must remind you that I haven't yet made my decision regarding your proposal." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said, his tone indulgent, "a lady must observe the proprieties, but I hope you understand that certain preparations must be made. I've already spoken with Pastor Wilson about a Christmas Eve service." "You've what?" Nora interrupted, unable to mask her shock. "Mr. Blackwood, that's entirely premature. I haven't agreed to anything." Blackwood's expression hardened, the mask of gentility slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. "Mrs. Haywood, Nora, I believe I've been quite clear about the time frame involved. Christmas Day, 23 days from now. The bank's patience has limits, even mine. And I've been clear that I need time to consider all options," Nora countered, finding courage in her growing indignation. "Arranging a wedding service before I've even accepted your proposal is presumptuous at best." For a moment, anger flashed in Blackwood's eyes, a cold, controlled anger that reminded Nora of a predator calculating its attack. Then just as quickly, the genial mask returned. "My apologies if I've overstepped," he said, his tone suggesting anything but contrition. "I merely wish to ensure everything would be in order when you make your decision. Time is, after all, of the essence." Before Nora could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Daniel Sullivan appeared around the bend in the road, his large frame unmistakable, even at a distance. Blackwood's expression darkened immediately. "I see you continue to entertain unusual company," he remarked, his voice carrying a note of disapproval. "I've made inquiries about Mr. Sullivan. His background is, shall we say, unclear. Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to help with some repairs around the ranch, Nora said deliberately, keeping her tone light. Good workers are hard to find, especially ones willing to accept payment in meals rather than money. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Indeed, though one wonders why a man of his limited capacities would offer such services, and why a respectable widow would accept them. The implication was clear and insulting. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks, anger replacing the unease she had felt moments before. Mr. Sullivan has shown nothing but respect and skill in his work here. I'd thank you not to cast aspersions on either his character or mine. Sullivan had drawn closer, close enough to hear their conversation. He slowed his horse clearly, sensing the tension, his eyes moving between Nora and Blackwood with unexpected sharpness. Mr. Sullivan, Nora called, deliberately turning away from Blackwood. Good morning. Jacob's been watching for you. Sullivan dismounted, removing his hat with the same deference he'd shown previously, though his eyes remained wary. Morning, Mrs. Haywood, he said, his speech still measured and careful. Sorry for lateness. Had to get supplies. He indicated a bag tied to his saddle. Blackwood studied Sullivan with undisguised contempt. Mr. Sullivan, he acknowledged coldly, I understand you've been occupying young Jacob's time. I hope you're not filling the boy's head with inappropriate ideas. Sullivan met Blackwood's gaze directly, something shifting in his posture, a subtle straightening of his spine, a squaring of his shoulders that made his considerable size more apparent. Teaching him tools, he said simply, useful skills. How quaint, Blackwood replied, his tone dismissive. Though I wonder if arithmetic and proper deportment might serve him better in the long term. He learns both, Sullivan said, each word deliberate and clear. Smart boy, learns fast. Before Blackwood could respond, Jacob burst from the house, his face lighting up at the sight of Sullivan. You came, he exclaimed, rushing down the porch steps. I knew you would. I've got the tools all ready for the door, just like you showed me. Sullivan's expression softened as he turned to the boy. Good morning, Jacob, he said, his speech noticeably more fluid than it had been with Blackwood. Ready to work? Jacob nodded eagerly, then seemed to notice Blackwood for the first time. His enthusiasm dimmed visibly. Oh, hello, Mr. Blackwood. Jacob, Blackwood nodded stiffly. I was just discussing with your mother the importance of proper education and associations for a young man of your potential. Jacob's face scrunched in confusion. Mr. Sullivan is teaching me lots of things, he said defensively. Important things Pa would have taught me if he broke off, his young voice catching. Sullivan placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. Your father would be proud, he said quietly, of how you're learning, how you're helping your mother. The simple words delivered with obvious sincerity brought tears to Jacob's eyes even as they straightened his posture. Nora felt her own throat tighten at the exchange. Blackwood cleared his throat, clearly discomfited by the emotional moment. Yes, well, I'm sure Samuel would have preferred his son learn from more conventional sources. He turned to Nora, his expression once again composed. I'll take my leave now, Mrs. Haywood. Please consider what we've discussed. I'll expect your answer no later than the 18th, 1 week before Christmas. The 18th, Nora questioned. You originally said Christmas Day. Circumstances have changed, Blackwood replied smoothly. Certain business matters require resolution before the holiday. I'm sure you understand the necessity of advanced planning. With that, he replaced his hat, nodded curtly to Sullivan, and returned to his carriage. As he drove away, Nora noticed how he surveyed the property with the calculating eye of someone already considering improvements to his new acquisition. I don't like him, Jacob declared once Blackwood was out of earshot. He looks at our ranch like it's already his. Sullivan, still standing beside his horse, nodded slightly. Sees value, he said quietly, not worth. The distinction struck Nora as unexpectedly profound. Blackwood indeed saw the material value of the ranch, its acreage, its potential profitability, but not its worth as a home, as the repository of a family's dreams and memories. Well, she said, forcing brightness into her voice, we have a barn door to fix, don't we, Jacob? Would you show Mr. Sullivan what you've prepared while I make us some coffee? As the males headed toward the barn, Nora touched the brooch Blackwood had pinned to her dress. The pearl gleamed in the winter sunlight, beautiful but cold, much like the man who had given it. With a decisive movement, she unpinned it and placed it in her pocket. She would return it at the first opportunity, unwilling to accept even the appearance of obligation. Inside the house, as she prepared coffee, Nora found her thoughts returning to Sullivan's words. Sees value, not worth. Such a simple phrase, yet it captured precisely what troubled her about Blackwood's proposal. He valued her ranch, perhaps even valued her as an appropriate wife for a man of his standing, but he had shown no indication that he saw her worth as a person with her own dreams and dignity. When she carried the coffee tray to the barn, she found Jacob and Sullivan already hard at work on the door. Sullivan had removed the damaged hinge and was showing Jacob how to straighten it using leverage and carefully applied pressure. See, physics helps us, Sullivan was explaining, his words coming more easily now that Blackwood was gone. Force applied at the right point can move much greater weight. Jacob nodded, his face serious with concentration. Like in the Bible story where the boy David beats the giant Goliath, he used physics too, right? Finding the right spot to hit with his sling. Sullivan smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed his weathered face. Exactly right. Small force, right place, big effect. Nora set the tray on a nearby workbench, listening to the exchange with growing curiosity. Sullivan's explanations were clear and pedagogically sound, demonstrating not just knowledge but a gift for teaching complex concepts in accessible ways. I brought coffee, she announced, making her presence known, and I saved some flapjacks from breakfast. Both males looked up Sullivan with a flicker of what might have been embarrassment, as it caught being more articulate than his assumed role allowed. Thank you, Mrs. Haywood, he said, his speech immediately becoming more halting. Very kind. Nora made a quick decision. Setting down the tray, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the Latin book. I believe this belongs to you, Mr. Sullivan, she said, holding it out. Jacob found it yesterday after you left. Sullivan froze, his eyes fixed on the book. For a moment, Nora thought he might deny ownership or even flee. Then, with obvious reluctance, he reached out to take it, his large hand engulfing the small volume. Thank you, he said quietly, tucking the book into his coat without further comment. It's an unusual choice of reading material, Nora continued carefully. Marcus Aurelius, in the original Latin no less. Sullivan's eyes met hers, wary but no longer attempting to hide the intelligence behind them. Good thoughts, he said simply. Worth studying. I wouldn't know, Nora admitted. My education didn't include Latin, though I've always regretted that limitation. A silent communication passed between them, Nora acknowledging what she had discovered without directly challenging his pretense, Sullivan recognizing her awareness without confirming or denying it. Jacob, oblivious to the subtext, piped up enthusiastically. Mr. Sullivan knows all sorts of things, Ma, not just about tools. He was just telling me about physics and how it's everywhere, even in Bible stories. Was he? Nora smiled, keeping her tone conversational. Mr. Sullivan seems to have a wealth of knowledge to share. Sullivan ducked his head, but not before Nora caught the flash of appreciation in his eyes. Gratitude for her discretion, perhaps, or for treating his knowledge as unremarkable rather than contradictory to his public persona. The rest of the morning passed in productive work, the three of them falling into an easy rhythm as they repaired the barn door. Sullivan continued to instruct Jacob, his explanations seamlessly, blending practical skills with underlying principles of mathematics and physics. Nora participated when needed, but mostly observed, noting how Sullivan's speech patterns shifted depending on the topic, more halting when discussing everyday matters, more fluid when explaining concepts that engaged his evident passion for teaching. By noon, the door hung perfectly, opening and closing with a smooth precision it hadn't possessed even when new. Jacob beamed with pride at their accomplishment, carefully returning tools to their proper places as Sullivan had taught him. Ma, can Mr. Sullivan stay for lunch? Jacob asked as they finished cleaning up. I want to show him my school books. He says he can help me understand fractions better if I see how they work with real things. Before Nora could respond, the sound of a wagon approaching drew their attention. Looking out the barn door, she recognized Martha Wheeler's faded blue wagon making its way up the path. Martha Wheeler was something of an anomaly in Ruby Creek, a widow in her 60s who had steadfastly refused to remarry or move in with relatives after her husband's death 15 years earlier. The town regarded her with a mixture of disapproval and reluctant respect, her independence both scandalous and secretly admired by other women. It's Mrs. Wheeler, Nora told Jacob. Would you run to the house and put the kettle on? She'll likely appreciate some hot tea after her drive. As Jacob hurried off, Nora noticed Sullivan retreating deeper into the barn, his posture suddenly tense. "You're welcome to stay," she assured him. "Mrs. Wheeler is one of the few people in Ruby Creek who doesn't concern herself with others' opinions." Sullivan shook his head. "Better if I go," he said, his speech once again measured and careful. Too many questions. Before Nora could press further, Martha's wagon pulled up to the barn. The older woman set the brake and climbed down with surprising agility for her age, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a practical bonnet. "Nora Haywood," she called, her voice carrying the slight rasp of a former smoker. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all, Martha," Nora replied warmly. "Jacob's putting on tea. Won't you come inside?" Martha's sharp eyes had already spotted Sullivan in the shadows of the barn. Mr. Sullivan?" She nodded, showing no surprise at his presence. "Good to see someone's helping with the repairs around here." This place was falling to pieces even before Samuel passed. Sullivan touched his hat respectfully, but remained silent, his discomfort evident in the set of his shoulders. "Don't worry, young man," Martha continued, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Your secret's safe with me. I've kept plenty in my day." Sullivan's eyes widened slightly, but he gave no other indication of having understood her cryptic remark. With a final nod to Nora, he moved to his horse, preparing to depart. "You're welcome to join us for lunch," Nora offered again, but Sullivan shook his head. "Thank you," he said, "but need to check traps before snow comes." He glanced at the heavy clouds that had been gathering all morning. "Back tomorrow for the—" He hesitated, as if searching for an excuse. "The chicken coop needs fixing." Of course, Nora agreed, recognizing his need to escape what had become an increasingly complicated situation. "Jacob will be disappointed to miss your help with his fractions, though." Something like regret crossed Sullivan's face. "Tomorrow," he promised. "Bring school books. We'll help then." As he rode away, Martha watched with knowing eyes. "Interesting man, your Mr. Sullivan," she remarked. "Not at all what he seems, is he?" Nora considered denying any special knowledge, but decided honesty might yield more information. "No," she agreed quietly. "He's not, but I haven't figured out why." Martha nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "Well, let's get inside before this weather turns. I've got things to tell you that shouldn't be overheard, and that tea your boy's making sounds better by the minute." Inside the small house, Jacob greeted Martha with the easy familiarity of a child who has known an adult all his life. Unlike many of Ruby Creek's residents, Martha had never treated Jacob with the awkward pity that so many directed toward the fatherless boy. Instead, she spoke to him as she would to any young person, with straightforward respect and occasional dry humor. "That kettle's taking its time, young man," she observed, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Might want to check if it's actually on the heat." Jacob hurried to the stove, discovering that in his excitement, he had indeed placed the kettle on the wrong burner. "Sorry, Mrs. Wheeler," he said quickly, correcting his mistake. "No harm done," Martha assured him. "Just means I'll have to talk more to stay warm." She turned to Nora, her expression becoming more serious. "I saw Blackwood's carriage heading back to town. Making his rounds early these days, isn't he?" Nora sighed, recognizing Martha's direct approach. The older woman had never been one for social niceties or beating around the bush. "He's eager to finalize our arrangement," she said, carefully conscious of Jacob's presence. Martha snorted. "Arrangement. That's a polite word for it." She glanced at Jacob, then back to Nora. "Boy, when that kettle boils, would you run out to my wagon and bring in the basket on the front seat? I brought some of my spice cake, but these old bones don't fancy another trip into the cold." It was a transparent excuse to speak privately, but Jacob accepted the task without question, eager to be helpful. As soon as he was out the door, Martha leaned forward. "Listen to me, Nora. You need to be careful with Blackwood. There's more to his interest in your property than he's letting on." "What do you mean?" Nora asked, though she had suspected as much herself. "Railroads coming through," Martha said flatly. "Not the main line, but a spur connecting to the Northern Pacific. The surveyors were out last spring, quiet-like, staying at that hotel in Helena rather than locally. But I've got eyes and ears, and I make it my business to know what's happening on my doorstep." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. And the road passes through my land, yours and mine both, Martha confirmed grimly, which explains why Blackwood's been pressing me to sell for the past year, offering generous terms for a woman in my situation. The sarcasm in her voice was palpable. I told him I'd die in my house and he could negotiate with my ghost. He never mentioned a railroad, Nora said, though the revelation clarified much about Blackwood's determined pursuit. Land that would soon host a railroad spur would be worth far more than its current agricultural value. Of course not, Martha scoffed. That would mean offering you a fair price instead of stealing it through foreclosure or marriage. She fixed Nora with a penetrating stare. Tell me you're not actually considering his proposal. Before Nora could respond, Jacob returned carrying a covered basket that emitted the enticing aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg. Found it, he announced proudly, and I checked the horse's blankets since it's getting colder. Good lad, Martha approved, accepting the basket. A boy who thinks ahead will make a fine man someday. She opened the basket, revealing not just the promised spice cake, but several jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. Thought you might appreciate some variety in your winter stores, she explained, her tone deliberately casual. My garden produced more than I can use this year. Nora recognized the gift for what it was: not charity, which would have been rejected, but the practical support of one independent woman for another. Thank you, Martha. That's very thoughtful. As they enjoyed tea and cake, Martha regaled them with town gossip, her sharp observations and wry commentary, drawing genuine laughter from both Haywoods. It was only when Jacob excused himself to check on the animals before the approaching storm that Martha returned to her warning. Blackwood's not just after your land, Nora, she said, her voice low and urgent. He's systematically buying up or foreclosing on properties all along the proposed railroad route. Those that he can't acquire through business, he pursues through other means. What other means? Nora asked, though she already suspected the answer. Marriage, strategic loans that he knows can't be repaid. And when those fail, Martha hesitated. Accidents. Accidents, Nora repeated, her blood running cold. Martha nodded grimly. 3 properties he wanted have changed hands in the past 2 years after unfortunate events. The Wilkins place after George fell from his roof during repairs. The old Peterson homestead after that fire destroyed their barn and livestock. And the Colton mining claim after the tunnel collapse. Those were all tragic accidents, Nora protested, though uncertainty had begun to creep into her voice. Perhaps, Martha conceded, but convenient ones for Garrett Blackwood. Especially the mine collapse that killed your Samuel and left that Colton boy with a limp. Nora felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. What are you saying, Martha? The older woman reached across the table to grasp Nora's hand. I'm saying be careful. I'm saying there's more to Blackwood's interest than desire for a wife or even just your land. And I'm saying, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, I'm saying your Mr. Sullivan isn't the only one in Ruby Creek hiding behind a mask. Before Nora could press for clarification, Jacob burst back into the kitchen, his cheeks red from the cold. Snow's starting, he announced excitedly. Big flakes. Martha rose from her chair with practiced efficiency. Then I'd best get home before the roads become impassable. Walk me to my wagon, Nora. I've got something else in the back you might find useful. Outside, large snowflakes drifted lazily from the iron-gray sky, beginning to accumulate on the frozen ground. Martha led Nora to the rear of her wagon and withdrew a small oilskin package. This came into my possession last year, she said quietly, passing it to Nora. I've been holding it, waiting for the right time. Given Blackwood's accelerated timeline, that time is now. Nora accepted the package, feeling the weight of paper inside. What is it? Open it when you're alone, Martha advised, and then decide for yourself what to do with the information. She climbed onto the wagon seat with practiced ease. One more thing. You're Mr. Sullivan. I saw him in Denver 3 years ago, dressed like a gentleman, speaking with lawyers outside the federal courthouse. He didn't see me, but I never forget a face. Who is he? Nora asked, but Martha shook her head. That's his story to tell if he chooses. But whatever brought him to Ruby Creek, whatever makes him hide behind simplicity, it's not shame or stupidity. She gathered the reins. Trust your instincts, Nora. They've served you well so far. As Martha's wagon disappeared down the snow-dusted road, Nora stood holding the mysterious package, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted yet again. First Sullivan with his hidden intelligence, now Martha with her ominous warnings about Blackwood and cryptic references to accidents that might not have been accidental at all. Samuel's death in the mine collapse had been devastating, but seemingly straightforward, a tragic workplace accident in an inherently dangerous profession. The idea that it might have been something more sinister, something connected to Blackwood's land acquisitions, was almost too terrible to contemplate. Yet as she turned back toward the house, the oilskin package heavy in her hands, Nora couldn't dismiss the possibility. Too many pieces were falling into place: Blackwood's determined pursuit of her land, the mysterious railroad plans, the pattern of accidents benefiting his business interests. Inside, she found Jacob at the table poring over his arithmetic homework with a determination she hadn't seen before Sullivan's influence. "Ma," he asked without looking up, "can fractions be used to measure time?" Mr. Sullivan said they could, but I don't understand how. The innocent question focused on Sullivan's teachings rather than the dark possibilities swirling in Nora's mind, provided a welcome anchor to normalcy. "Yes," she said, setting aside the oilskin package for later examination. "Think about a clock. What's half an hour?" Jacob's face lit up with understanding. 30 minutes. "So that's one half of an hour, just like one half of a pie is 2 out of 4 pieces." "Exactly." Nora smiled, settling beside him. "Show me what other problems you're working on." For the next hour, as the snow fell more heavily outside, Nora helped Jacob with his schoolwork, pushing aside thoughts of Blackwood Sullivan and Martha's warnings. There would be time to unravel those mysteries after Jacob was asleep. Yet even as she guided her son through the predictable patterns of arithmetic, a restless anxiety hummed beneath her calm exterior. If Martha was right, if Blackwood's interest in her property was connected to the railroad, if his pursuit had more sinister motivations than mere business advantage, then the stakes of her decision had risen dramatically. And if Sullivan was indeed hiding a more complex identity behind his simple facade, what role might he play in the unfolding drama? Friend or foe, potential ally, or another threat to be navigated? As darkness fell and the snow continued to accumulate, Nora tucked Jacob into bed with a promise that Sullivan would help with his fractions tomorrow. Then, alone in the kitchen with only the crackling fire for company, she finally unwrapped Martha's mysterious package. Inside were several folded documents, what appeared to be survey maps, correspondence, on railroad company letterhead, and most disturbingly, a handwritten letter in a script Nora recognized immediately as Samuel's. Her hands trembling slightly, she unfolded the letter first, hunger for her husband's words overriding all other curiosity. "My dearest Nora," it began, dated just 3 weeks before the mine collapse. "I've discovered something troubling about the mine operations that I must bring to Mr. Colton's attention tomorrow. The new support beams Blackwood authorized are substandard, barely half the thickness required by safety regulations. I've documented the discrepancies and calculated the cost savings, nearly $5,000, which appears to have been pocketed rather than reinvested in proper equipment. I hesitate to commit more details to paper, but please know that if anything should happen to me, these documents should be taken to Judge Peterson in Helena. He's an honest man who will ensure justice is served. I don't mean to frighten you, my love, but I've overheard conversations that suggest Blackwood is involved in land speculation connected to railroad expansion. The Colton mine property appears to be particularly valuable in this regard. Until this matter is resolved, please be cautious in any dealings with the bank. I've made arrangements with my brother in Denver regarding our property deed that should protect you and Jacob regardless of what happens. All my love." Samuel. Nora stared at the letter, her husband's voice seeming to rise from the page with painful clarity. Samuel had suspected Blackwood of dangerous cost-cutting and possible corruption. He had planned to report these findings the very day before the mine collapse that took his life. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. With shaking hands, she examined the remaining documents. The survey maps indeed showed a proposed railroad spur cutting directly through both her property and Martha's, with Blackwood's bank marked as the owner of several key parcels along the route. The correspondence detailed negotiations between railroad executives and a local representative, referred to only as GB, Garrett Blackwood presumably. Most damning of all was a cost analysis of the mine operation in Samuel's meticulous handwriting, documenting systematic reductions in safety measures alongside calculations of the resulting savings. The final page bore a note in different handwriting. "Martha's." Nora realized, found among Samuel's personal effects at the mine office, retrieved before Blackwood's men cleared out his desk. The implications were staggering. If these documents were accurate, Blackwood had not only compromised mine safety for profit, but might be directly implicated in Samuel's death, a death that conveniently removed an obstacle to his plans while simultaneously placing the Haywood Ranch in financial jeopardy, ripe for acquisition. Nora sat motionless at the kitchen table, the documents spread before her, as the full horror of the situation settled into her bones. Blackwood wasn't just a calculating businessman pursuing a practical marriage arrangement. He was potentially a murderer, or at minimum someone whose greed had directly contributed to her husband's death. And now he was pressuring her to marry him, to hand over not just her property, but herself and her son, to the very man who might have orchestrated their greatest loss. The thought was unbearable. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, Nora Haywood made a decision. She would not marry Garrett Blackwood. Not now, not ever, even if it meant losing the ranch, even if it meant starting over with nothing but her son and her dignity. Some prices were simply too high to pay, some compromises too devastating to contemplate. As she carefully refolded the documents and secured them in the hiding place where she kept their meager savings, Nora's thoughts turned to Daniel Sullivan. What was his connection to all this? A coincidental visitor with his own secrets, or someone with a more direct tie to the unfolding events Martha had seen him in Denver at the federal courthouse? Samuel's letter mentioned arrangements with his brother in Denver regarding their property deed. Were these facts connected or merely coincidental? Tomorrow, when Sullivan returned to help Jacob with his fractions, Nora resolved to seek answers carefully, respectfully, but persistently. Whatever game was being played in Ruby Creek, she needed to understand all the pieces on the board if she hoped to protect herself and her son. With that determination firmly in mind, she banked the fire for the night and retired to her bedroom. Samuel's letter tucked beneath her pillow like a talisman against the gathering storm, both literal and figurative. Morning revealed a world transformed by snow. Nearly a foot had fallen overnight, with more still coming down in gentle waves. The landscape gleamed pristine and peaceful, belying the turmoil in Nora's heart after her discoveries of the previous day. Jacob predictably was delighted by the snowfall, his excitement only heightened by the prospect of Sullivan's return. "Do you think he'll still come in all this snow?" he asked repeatedly as they completed the morning chores, his eyes constantly straying to the window. "If he can travel safely." Nora answered, not wanting to build up expectations that might be dashed by practical realities. The road to their ranch would be difficult after such heavy snowfall, particularly for someone who lived on the outskirts of town, as Sullivan apparently did. Yet as midday approached with no sign of their visitor, even Nora found herself watching the road with growing disappointment. She had prepared her questions carefully, planning a gentle approach that might encourage Sullivan to share his true identity without feeling cornered or exposed. "Maybe the snow's too deep," Jacob suggested, his earlier enthusiasm fading into resignation. "Or maybe he forgot." "I'm sure Mr. Sullivan hasn't forgotten," Nora assured him, though privately she wondered if their discoveries, her recognition of his Latin book, Martha's comments about seeing him in Denver, might have frightened him away permanently. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable in the winter quiet, proved both assumptions wrong. Jacob rushed to the window, his face lighting up as Sullivan's large figure emerged from the swirling flakes, leading his horse, rather than riding presumably to reduce the animal's burden in the deep snow. "He came," Jacob exclaimed, already reaching for his coat. "And he's walking instead of riding. That's smart because horses can get snow stuck in their hooves and it makes them slip." Nora smiled at this regurgitation of knowledge clearly gleaned from Sullivan. "Let's help him get his horse settled in the barn," she suggested. "It's too cold for the poor animal to stand outside while you work on fractions." They trudged through the snow together, meeting Sullivan halfway between the road and the house. Despite the cold, he appeared comfortable, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, but his movements steady and purposeful. "Mr. Sullivan," Jacob called, waving enthusiastically. "You came?" Sullivan nodded, a small smile visible beneath his beard. "Promised," he said simply. "Brought books." He patted a satchel hanging at his side. "We thought the snow might keep you away," Nora explained as they led the way to the barn. Sullivan shook his head. "Good boots," he replied, lifting one foot slightly to demonstrate his practical footwear. "And quiet time. To think." There was something different about him today, Nora noticed. Though his speech remained measured and his demeanor reserved, he seemed less guarded, as if some decision had been reached during a solitary journey through the snow. Once inside the barn, Sullivan tended to his horse with practiced efficiency, declining Jacob's offers of help with gentle redirection rather than outright refusal. Check the other animals, he suggested. Make sure water's not frozen. While Jacob eagerly took on this responsibility, Sullivan turned to Nora, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. Need to talk, he said quietly, after helping Jacob. Important. The simple statement confirmed Nora's sense that something had shifted. Yes, she agreed. I think that would be wise. For the next 2 hours, Sullivan worked with Jacob at the kitchen table, patiently explaining the principles of fractions using practical examples from ranch life. How a day divided into morning, afternoon, and evening represented thirds. How a four-strand fence required understanding quarters to calculate materials properly. How recipes needed proper fractional measurements to maintain proportions when scaled up or down. Nora observed from the periphery, ostensibly occupied with mending, but actually studying Sullivan's teaching methods. His explanations were clear and pedagogically sound, building systematically from concrete examples to abstract concepts in a way that engaged Jacob completely. This was no simple man fumbling through basic tasks, but an educated individual with a gift for instruction. When Jacob finally grasped a particularly challenging concept about equivalent fractions, his face lit up with the pure joy of understanding. I get it, he exclaimed. 3/6 is the same as 1/2 because both mean the same amount just divided differently. Sullivan nodded, his own expression reflecting satisfaction in his student's achievement. Exactly right. Numbers look different, but represent same reality. The phrase seemed laden with meaning beyond mathematics, and Sullivan's glance toward Nora suggested the parallel was intentional. Different appearances could indeed mask the same underlying reality, a truth that applied to people as well as numbers. As the light began to fade, signaling the early winter sunset, Sullivan gently closed the arithmetic book. Enough for today, he declared. Good progress. Jacob beamed with pride. Can we do more tomorrow? I want to show Miss Abernathy that I understand all this when I go back to school next week. Sullivan hesitated, his eyes once again finding Nora's. If your mother permits, he said carefully. Why don't you check on the animals one more time before dark, Jacob? Nora suggested, recognizing the opportunity for the private conversation Sullivan had requested earlier. Make sure they have enough hay for the night. Though clearly reluctant to leave his new teacher, Jacob nodded obediently. I'll be quick, he promised, pulling on his coat and heading out into the fading afternoon light. Once alone, a heavy silence fell between the adults. Sullivan stood near the fireplace, his large frame somehow less imposing than it had seemed initially, his posture communicating caution rather than threat. You know, he said finally, his speech still measured but no longer artificially halting. About me, that I'm not what I appear. Nora nodded, seeing no reason to deny the obvious. The Latin book gave you away, she admitted, and Martha Wheeler says she saw you in Denver at the federal courthouse. Dressed very differently than you are now. Sullivan's expression revealed neither surprise nor alarm at this information, only a weary acceptance. Mrs. Wheeler is observant, he acknowledged. Few people look beyond appearances. Who are you really? Nora asked directly. And why the pretense? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, seemingly weighing his response. Finally, he sighed deeply. My name is Daniel Sullivan, he began. That much is true. But I was once Judge Sullivan of the Federal Circuit Court in Denver. Before that, a prosecutor specializing in corruption cases. The revelation, though not entirely unexpected after Martha's hints, still shocked Nora. A federal judge, one of the most respected and powerful positions in the territory, hiding in plain sight as a supposedly simple laborer in a remote Montana town. Why? She asked simply. Sullivan moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, as if the answer might be found there. 3 years ago, I was investigating corruption involving railroad land acquisitions, bribes to officials, fraudulent surveys, intimidation of homesteaders. He turned back to face her. Powerful interests were implicated, very powerful, and they came after you. Nora guessed the pieces beginning to fit together. Sullivan nodded grimly. An accident was arranged. My carriage overturned on a mountain road. My driver was killed. I was presumed dead as well, but managed to crawl to safety despite my injuries. Almost unconsciously, Nora's eyes went to his movements, searching for signs of old wounds. Sullivan noticed and grimaced slightly. The physical scars have mostly healed, he said quietly, though the back never quite straightened properly. So you've been hiding here, Nora continued the story unfolding with terrible logic, pretending to be limited so no one would connect you to the judge who disappeared. Simpler to be thought simple, Sullivan confirmed with a humorless smile. People underestimate, overlook, speak freely around those they believe can't fully understand. A suspicion began to form in Nora's mind, connecting Sullivan's story to the documents Martha had provided and Samuel's letter about railroad interest. You're still investigating, she realized. Here in Ruby Creek, the railroad expansion, the land acquisitions, it's connected to your case in Denver, isn't it? Sullivan's eyes widened, slightly impressed by her quick deduction. Yes, he admitted. The same network of corruption extends throughout the territory. Different names, same methods. He hesitated, then added softly, the same disregard for human life when profits are at stake. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Samuel's death, the substandard support beams, Blackwood's convenient acquisition of properties along the railroad route. My husband, Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. The mine collapse. It wasn't an accident, was it? Sullivan's expression conveyed deep regret and compassion. I can't prove it yet, he said gently. But no, I don't believe it was. Samuel Haywood was a meticulous engineer who documented safety violations and planned to report them. The timing of the collapse immediately before he could present his findings is suspicious at best. The confirmation of her worst fears should have devastated Nora, yet somehow having her suspicions validated brought a strange clarity rather than fresh grief. The enemy had a name, a face. The seemingly random tragedy that had upended her life had purpose and direction, however malevolent. Blackwood, she said, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. He's part of this corruption you're investigating. Sullivan nodded grimly. A key player locally, though not the mastermind. He acquires land along proposed routes using whatever methods prove expedient: foreclosure, coerced sales, strategic marriages. His eyes met hers directly. Or eliminating obstacles. The full implications struck Nora with chilling force. And now he's pressing me to marry him by the 18th. He's accelerated his timeline, suddenly demanding an answer a week before Christmas, rather than on Christmas Day, as originally stated. The railroad survey team returns on the 20th, Sullivan explained. Final approvals for the spring construction will be signed then. Blackwood needs clear title to all properties along the route before that date. So I have 1 week, Nora said, her mind racing through limited options. 1 week to either accept his proposal or lose the ranch. Unless there's another option, Sullivan suggested quietly. Something in Samuel's arrangements that might protect your ownership. Nora thought of Samuel's letter, his mention of arrangements with my brother in Denver regarding our property deed. Could there be some legal protection she wasn't aware of? Samuel's letter mentioned arrangements with his brother, she said slowly. But I've had no contact with his family since the funeral. They live in Denver and travel was... She trailed off, the practical impossibilities of a widow with limited means making the point for her. Sullivan's expression shifted subtly, a new determination visible in his eyes. I need to see that letter, he said, and any other documents you have. There might be legal protections we can leverage, especially if I can connect Blackwood to the mine safety violations. The "we" in his statement wasn't lost on Nora. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't facing her challenges alone. This man, this judge in hiding, was offering not just sympathy, but practical assistance based on his considerable expertise. Yet caution tempered her relief. Why would you risk your cover to help us? You've successfully hidden your identity for years. Getting involved with my situation could expose you to the very people who tried to kill you. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window where Jacob could be seen trudging back from the barn, his small figure leaning into the wind. Some things matter more than safety, he said finally. Justice, truth. His eyes returned to Nora's, protecting those who can't protect themselves. Before Nora could respond, the door burst open and Jacob rushed in, bringing a swirl of snowflakes and youthful energy. All the animals are fine, he reported. And guess what? Daisy's going to have a calf, I can tell, because her sides are getting really round. The serious conversation necessarily paused as Jacob recounted his observations of the pregnant cow, Sullivan listening with the same respectful attention he gave to all the boys' discoveries. Yet throughout the evening that followed a simple dinner, more arithmetic lessons, Jacob's reluctant departure for bed, Nora felt the weight of unfinished business between them. Only after Jacob was asleep did Sullivan return to their interrupted discussion, his voice low to avoid waking the boy in the small house. "I should leave soon," he said, glancing at the darkness outside. "But first those documents you mentioned. Samuel's letter. May I see them?" Nora retrieved the oilskin package from its hiding place, spreading the contents on the kitchen table. Sullivan examined each item methodically, his trained legal mind evident in the systematic way he cross-referenced information between documents. "This is significant evidence," he said finally. Samuel documented the safety violations thoroughly. Combined with the railroad correspondence and survey maps, it establishes motive for interfering with his planned report. "Is it enough to prove Blackwood was involved in his death?" Nora asked the question that had haunted her since reading Samuel's letter. Sullivan's expression was regretful but honest. "Not directly, no. It establishes opportunity and motive but not action. For that, we'd need testimony from someone directly involved in the substandard beam installation or documentation linking Blackwood to specific orders to cut corners." Nora's hope faltered. "So it's useless?" "Not at all," Sullivan countered firmly. "It's enough to justify a formal investigation, especially if presented to the right authorities. And it may help with your more immediate problem, Blackwood's attempt to acquire your property." He picked up Samuel's letter again, focusing on the line about arrangements with his brother in Denver. This reference to property deed arrangements could be crucial. Land ownership law is complex with various provisions for family homesteads that can supersede normal foreclosure procedures. "What are you suggesting?" Nora asked, trying to follow his legal reasoning. Sullivan leaned forward, his expression intent. "I need to contact Samuel's brother in Denver. If Samuel established some form of protected family trust or conditional deed, it might prevent foreclosure regardless of the mortgage situation." "But how?" Nora questioned. "The roads are nearly impassable with this snow, and Denver is days away even in good weather." "I have connections," Sullivan said carefully. "People who still communicate with me through carefully established channels. I can send a telegram from the next town over where I'm not known, requesting specific information about the Haywood property deed." The plan seemed tenuous at best, dependent on too many variables outside their control. Yet Nora found herself clinging to this slender thread of hope, if only because the alternatives, marriage to Blackwood or loss of her home, were increasingly unthinkable. "And in the meantime," she asked, "Blackwood expects my answer in 1 week." Sullivan considered this practical problem. "Delay," he advised. "Express uncertainty, request more time to consider such an important decision. Men like Blackwood enjoy the feeling of persuasion. Let him believe he's convincing you gradually. And if that doesn't work, if he insists on an immediate answer," a shadow crossed Sullivan's face, "then say yes," he said reluctantly. "A provisional yes, conditional on proper legal arrangements that will take time to prepare. We need only delay until I can secure the deed information from Denver." The suggestion of even pretending to accept Blackwood's proposal filled Nora with revulsion, but she recognized the pragmatic wisdom in Sullivan's strategy. Time was their most precious commodity, now each day a chance to uncover the legal protections Samuel might have established. "Very well," she agreed, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I'll delay as long as possible." "But Daniel," she used his first name, deliberately acknowledging the shift in their relationship from strangers to allies. "Be careful. If Blackwood is responsible for Samuel's death, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another threat." Sullivan's expression softened at her concern. "I've survived 3 years by being careful," he assured her, "and I have experience with men like Blackwood. They're predictable in their ruthlessness, which makes them easier to outmaneuver than you might think." As he gathered his things to leave the night, having grown late during their conversation, Sullivan paused at the door. "I'll return in 2 days, weather permitting. Continue the lessons with Jacob as a natural explanation for my presence." Nora nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind throughout their discussion. "Why did you decide to reveal yourself to me? You could have simply disappeared when you realized I'd discovered your secret." Sullivan was quiet for a moment, his hand on the door latch. Because sometimes hiding becomes another kind of prison, he said finally. And because Jacob needs someone who sees his potential, not just his father's absence. He met her eyes directly. And because you deserve the truth, especially about Samuel's death. With that, he stepped out into the snowy night, leaving Nora with more questions than answers, but also with something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not hope for an easy resolution, the challenges ahead remained daunting, but hope that she wasn't facing them entirely alone. That justice for Samuel might still be possible. That the future, however uncertain, held possibilities beyond Blackwood's cruel ultimatum. As she banked the fire for the night, Nora found herself drawn to the window, watching Sullivan's tall figure fade into the swirling snow. A federal judge hiding as a simple laborer, a widow fighting to save her home, a boy mourning his father while trying to become a man too soon. Three lives connected by circumstance and loss now joined in a common cause against corruption and greed. Whether they would prevail remained to be seen, but for the first time since Samuel's death, Nora felt the stirring of something stronger than mere survival. The determination to fight not just for what was hers, but for what was right. With that resolve firmly in mind, she turned from the window and prepared to face whatever challenges the coming days might bring. The storm that had brought so much snow continued throughout the night, blanketing Ruby Creek in pristine white. By morning, the world outside Nora's window looked transformed, familiar shapes rendered alien by heavy drifts, the boundary between earth and sky blurred by still falling flakes. Jacob naturally was delighted. "No school today," he declared, peering out at the winter wonderland. "We could build a snow fort, Mister Sullivan might help us when he comes back." Nora smiled at her son's enthusiasm while inwardly acknowledging that the weather complicated their already precarious situation. If the roads remained impassable, Sullivan's plan to contact Samuel's brother in Denver would be delayed. Yet the same conditions might buy them precious time with Blackwood, who would surely not venture out in such treacherous conditions. "Let's focus on chores first," she reminded Jacob gently. "The animals still need tending, storm or no storm." Together they battled their way through knee-deep snow to the barn, where the livestock greeted them with impatient sounds. The familiar routine of feeding and watering provided a comforting normalcy, a brief respite from the web of deception and danger that Nora now knew surrounded them. "Ma," Jacob asked as they worked, "is Mr. Sullivan going to keep teaching me, even after I understand fractions?" The question carried more weight than her son realized. "Would you like that?" she asked carefully. Jacob nodded emphatically. "He doesn't treat me like a baby, and he explains things so they make sense, not just rules to memorize." He hesitated, then added quietly, "He reminds me of Pa sometimes, the way he listens when I talk." The comparison to Samuel caught Nora off guard. She had been so focused on Sullivan's revelations and the threat posed by Blackwood that she hadn't fully considered what the man's presence meant to Jacob, a male figure who offered the respect and guidance the boy had lost with his father's death. "I think Mr. Sullivan enjoys teaching you," she said truthfully. "And yes, if it's possible, I believe he'll continue. If they still had a home where such lessons could take place. If Sullivan wasn't forced to flee when his investigation inevitably threatened Blackwood's plans. If they all survived the dangerous game now unfolding around them." So many ifs. The day passed slowly, the continuing storm keeping them housebound after the essential chores were completed. Nora used the time to review Samuel's documents again, searching for any additional clues about the arrangements he might have made with his brother in Denver. Jacob practiced his fractions, determined to impress Sullivan with his progress when the man returned. By late afternoon, the snow had finally stopped, though gray clouds still hung low over the landscape. The sudden silence after the constant whisper of falling snow felt almost unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. That silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of approaching horses, not one but several moving with purpose through the deep snow. Nora's first thought was of Sullivan, perhaps returning with help to clear the roads. But as she moved to the window, her heart sank. Garrett Blackwood's sleigh, pulled by two powerful horses and followed by a second sleigh, carrying what appeared to be three men, was making its way up the path to her home. "Jacob," she said, working to keep her voice calm, "please go to your room for now. Mr. Blackwood is here with some men." "But why?" "Please, Jacob," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I need to speak with them privately. Adult business." Though clearly unhappy with the dismissal, Jacob nodded and retreated to his small bedroom, the set of his shoulders communicating his displeasure more eloquently than words. Nora took a moment to compose herself, straightening her simple dress and smoothing her hair. Then, drawing a deep breath, she opened the front door just as Blackwood was preparing to knock. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him with forced politeness. "This is an unexpected visit, especially in such weather." Blackwood smiled, brushing snow from his expensive coat. "Mrs. Haywood, the storm has finally passed, and I was concerned about your welfare out here isolated as you are." His gaze moved past her into the house. "May I come in? The cold is rather biting." Though every instinct urged her to refuse, Nora stepped aside. "Of course, though I'm afraid I wasn't expecting company." Blackwood entered, followed by Sheriff Morgan, a thin man with a perpetual expression of mild discomfort, and two strangers in business attire, whose purpose Nora could not immediately discern. The small kitchen suddenly felt crowded, the four men bringing with them the chill of the outside air and an undercurrent of tension that raised the hairs on Nora's neck. "Mrs. Haywood," Blackwood began once they were all inside, "I've taken the liberty of bringing some gentlemen who can help expedite our arrangement." He gestured to the two strangers. "Mr. Reynolds is my attorney, and Mr. Wilson represents the bank's interests in Helena. Given the weather and the approaching holiday season, I thought it prudent to address the legal formalities now, rather than risk further delays." The calculated presumption stole Nora's breath. Blackwood hadn't just come to pressure her for an answer, he'd brought the legal machinery to finalize their arrangement immediately. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed, fighting to keep her voice at him, "while I appreciate your efficiency, I believe I made it clear that I needed time to consider your proposal." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Indeed you did. However, circumstances have changed." He nodded to Mr. Reynolds, who withdrew several documents from his leather portfolio. "These papers require immediate attention," Blackwood continued. "The bank's board has moved up their review of outstanding loans, and without immediate action, I'm afraid foreclosure proceedings would begin tomorrow rather than after Christmas." "And tomorrow," Nora repeated the acceleration of his timeline, catching her completely off guard. "But you said banking is subject to many variables, Mrs. Haywood," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "Fortunately, I've arranged an alternative that would resolve the situation to everyone's satisfaction." Mr. Reynolds laid the papers on the kitchen table, a marriage certificate, and what appeared to be property transfer documents. "A simple ceremony this evening with these gentlemen as witnesses would legally establish our union," Blackwood explained. "The subsequent property arrangements would consolidate your deed with my holdings, resolving the outstanding debt immediately." The trap was springing closed faster than Nora had anticipated. Sullivan had warned her to delay to stall for time while he investigated the property deed arrangements Samuel had mentioned. But Blackwood had outmaneuvered them, accelerating his timeline to prevent exactly such a strategy. "This evening," she echoed, her mind racing for any way to forestall what was clearly a carefully orchestrated plan. "That's impossibly sudden. There are preparations, considerations." "All taken care of," Blackwood assured her. "Pastor Wilson is waiting in town, and Mrs. Jenkins has kindly arranged a small reception at her home. Your presence and young Jacob's is all that's required." The mention of her son sent a chill through Nora. "Jacob isn't feeling well," she improvised. "He's resting now. I couldn't possibly disrupt his recovery for a wedding ceremony." Sheriff Morgan, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Haywood, if I might speak plainly," he began, his weathered face reflecting genuine concern. "Mr. Blackwood has been more than generous in his handling of your situation. The bank would be within its rights to foreclose immediately given the circumstances." "What circumstances exactly?" Nora asked, seizing on any opportunity to gain information or time. The sheriff exchanged glances with Blackwood before continuing. "There's been some irregularity discovered in your property deed. Questions about proper ownership that could complicate any transfer or loan arrangements." This unexpected revelation sent Nora's thoughts racing. Could this be related to the arrangements Samuel had made with his brother? Had Blackwood discovered something that threatened his plans? "What kind of irregularity?" she pressed, watching Blackwood's face carefully. The banker stepped forward, effectively cutting off the sheriff's response. "Technical matters that need not concern you," he said dismissively. "The important point is that these papers," he tapped the documents on the table, "will resolve all such issues permanently." Translation, the marriage and property transfer would override whatever legal protection Samuel might have established. Blackwood was trying to circumvent potential obstacles through a hasty ceremony that would give him direct control of the ranch. I need time to read these documents carefully, Nora insisted, grasping for any delay tactic. No sensible person would sign legal papers without proper review. Mr. Reynolds, the attorney, nodded as if this were a reasonable request. Of course, Mrs. Haywood. However, given the urgent timeline, perhaps you could review them now while we wait. I'd be happy to explain any legal terminology that might be unfamiliar. They had anticipated her every move, closing each potential avenue of escape with practiced efficiency. Nora felt panic rising in her chest but forced it down. What would Sullivan advise in this moment? Delay. Create complications. Find excuses that couldn't be immediately dismissed. Gentlemen, she said, drawing herself up with as much dignity as she could muster, I appreciate the urgency you've conveyed. However, there are matters beyond legal documents that require consideration before I can commit to marriage. She turned directly to Blackwood, not least of which are arrangements regarding my son's future and education, which we have not yet discussed in detail. Blackwood's expression tightened momentarily before smoothing into practiced benevolence. My dear Mrs. Haywood, young Jacob's welfare is naturally a primary concern. I've already made inquiries about the finest boarding schools in Denver, where he would receive an education far superior to anything available in Ruby Creek. Boarding school? The suggestion caught Nora completely off guard. Jacob is only 10 years old. He's never been away from home. Precisely why proper schooling is so important at this formative age, Blackwood continued smoothly. A boy without a father's guidance can develop unfortunate tendencies if not properly directed. The structure and discipline of a good boarding school would ensure he grows into a respectable young man. The implication was clear. Blackwood had no intention of having Jacob underfoot in his new household. The boy would be sent away, separated from his home and his mother under the guise of proper education. Before Nora could formulate a response, the back door burst open, admitting a swirl of cold air and the sound of childish sobbing. Jacob stood in the doorway, his face streaked with tears and contorted with rage. I won't go, he shouted, his small fists clenched at his sides. You can't make me leave, Ma. I hate you. Nora moved quickly to her son's side, placing protective hands on his shoulders. Jacob, you're supposed to be in your room. He wants to send me away, Jacob interrupted, his voice breaking with emotion. I heard him. He's going to make you marry him and send me away. Blackwood's face darkened at this disruption to his carefully orchestrated scenario. Young man, he began sternly, eavesdropping on adult conversations is extremely disrespectful. This outburst only confirms my assessment that you require more structured guidance than your current situation provides. Jacob's response was immediate and visceral. He broke free from Nora's grip and launched himself at Blackwood, small fists flailing ineffectually against the man's substantial frame. You're not my father. You'll never be my father. My father was good and brave, and you're just mean. Sheriff Morgan moved quickly, gently, but firmly, restraining the boy before he could do any actual damage. That's enough now, son, he said, his voice kind but authoritative. This isn't helping your mother. Jacob went limp in the sheriff's grasp, his rage giving way to heartbroken sobs. Please, Ma, he pleaded, looking up at Nora with red-rimmed eyes. Please don't marry him. Please don't send me away. The raw emotion in her son's voice crystallized something in Nora's heart. Whatever legal or financial consequences might follow, she would not subject Jacob to the trauma of separation, nor bind herself to a man who viewed her child as an inconvenience to be dispatched to a distant institution. There will be no wedding today, she said firmly, moving to take Jacob from the sheriff's grasp. And no boarding school for my son. I appreciate your concern for our welfare, Mr. Blackwood, but I cannot accept your proposal under these or any other terms. The banker's mask of benevolence slipped, completely revealing the cold calculation beneath. Mrs. Haywood, perhaps you fail to understand the gravity of your situation. Without my intervention, you will lose this property tomorrow. You and your son will have nowhere to go, no means of support. We'll manage, Nora replied, her arms tightening protectively around Jacob, as we have for 2 years since my husband's death. Your husband? Blackwood's voice took on a contemptuous edge. Left you in an untenable position through his own poor judgment. I've offered you a respectable solution that many women in your circumstances would gratefully accept. Nora felt a surge of anger at this dismissal of Samuel. My husband was a good man who valued honesty and safety above profit. She said the words emerging before she could consider their implication. Unlike some who cut corners on mine supports to save money regardless of the risk to workers' lives. The room went utterly still. Blackwood's face drained of color, then flushed with anger. What exactly are you implying, Mrs. Haywood? Too late, Nora realized she had revealed knowledge she shouldn't possess information from Samuel's documents about the substandard support beams Blackwood had authorized. Information that suggested his complicity in the mine collapse that had killed her husband. Sheriff Morgan looked between them, confusion evident on his weathered face. What's this about mine supports? Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension. Through the window, Nora could see Daniel Sullivan dismounting from his horse, his large frame unmistakable, even at a distance. Blackwood followed her gaze, his expression darkening further when he recognized the visitor. Your simple friend seems to have developed quite an attachment to your property, he observed coldly. One might almost suspect his interest extends beyond casual labor. The implication made Nora's cheeks burn, but she refused to dignify it with a response. Instead, she used Sullivan's arrival as an opportunity to break the standoff. Gentlemen, I believe we've concluded our business for today. I've given you my answer, and I would appreciate it if you would respect my decision. This isn't over, Mrs. Haywood, Blackwood said, his voice low and threatening. The foreclosure will proceed tomorrow. By this time next week, you'll have nothing, not this land, not this house, not even the dignity of my offer. He gestured sharply to his companions, who gathered their papers with practiced efficiency. As they moved toward the door, Sullivan appeared on the porch, his expression shifting from friendly anticipation to wary alertness at the sight of the unexpected gathering. Mr. Sullivan, Blackwood acknowledged coldly as they filed past. Such dedication to your employment venturing out in these conditions. Sullivan touched his hat respectfully, reverting to his simple persona in the presence of the others. Just checking on animals, he said, his speech deliberately halting. After storm. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as if trying to peer beneath the facade. Indeed, how fortunate for Mrs. Haywood to have such devoted assistants. Once the sleighs had departed, disappearing down the snow-covered road toward town, Sullivan entered the kitchen to find Nora still holding Jacob, who had subsided into occasional hiccuping sobs. What happened? Sullivan asked, dropping the pretense of simplicity now that they were alone. Nora quickly explained Blackwood's accelerated timeline, the marriage documents, the threat of immediate foreclosure, and the revelation about irregularities in the property deed. And he wants to send me away to boarding school. Jacob added, his voice small but indignant. He says I need structure and discipline because I don't have a father. Sullivan's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. He's moving faster than anticipated. He observed, removing his snow-dusted coat and hanging it by the door. The mention of deed irregularities is telling. He must have discovered something that threatens his plans. Could it be related to whatever arrangements Samuel made with his brother? Nora asked, hope kindling, despite the dire situation. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. It's likely. I managed to send a telegram yesterday before the worst of the storm hit. If we're fortunate, we'll have a response within a day or two. We don't have a day or two. Nora reminded him, the reality of their situation settling like a weight on her shoulders. Blackwood says foreclosure proceedings begin tomorrow. Then we need to act tonight, Sullivan said decisively. Jacob, would you bring me the documents your mother has been keeping? The ones from Mrs. Wheeler. As Jacob hurried to retrieve the oilskin package, Sullivan turned to Nora, his expression grave but determined. I believe it's time to end this charade. Not just my pretense of simplicity, but Blackwood's facade of respectability. How? Nora asked, both frightened and exhilarated by the resolution in his voice. By using the truth as our weapon, Sullivan replied. Samuel's documentation of the safety violations combined with the railroad correspondence establishes a pattern of corruption that extends beyond mere financial impropriety. If we present this evidence to the right authorities— Blackwood is the authority in Ruby Creek, Nora interrupted. He controls the bank influences. The sheriff has the ear of every businessman in town. which is why we won't present it in Ruby Creek, Sullivan countered. There's a federal marshal in Helena investigating related cases of railroad corruption. I've worked with him before indirectly. If we can get these documents to him tonight, he has the authority to issue an injunction preventing any property transfers until the investigation is complete. The plan seemed both desperate and dangerous. Helena is nearly 30 miles away, Nora pointed out. In these conditions, with the roads barely passable, I can make it, Sullivan assured her. I've traveled worse routes under more dangerous circumstances. Jacob returned with the document package, his earlier distress replaced by solemn purpose. Are these going to help us stop Mr. Blackwood? He asked, handing them to Sullivan. They might, Sullivan answered honestly, kneeling to meet the boy at eye level. Your father was a brave man who documented things that powerful people wanted kept secret. These papers are his legacy to you and your mother, proof of his integrity and courage. Jacob's chest swelled visibly at this description of his father. He always said that telling the truth was more important than being liked, he said softly, even when it's hard. Wise words, Sullivan agreed, rising to his feet. And now we need to honor that wisdom by getting these documents to someone who can act on them. He turned to Nora. I should leave immediately to reach Helena by morning. The prospect of Sullivan departing, of facing Blackwood's retaliation alone, sent a surge of fear through Nora. Yet she recognized the logic of his plan. What should we do while you're gone? She asked. Pack essentials, Sullivan advised grimly. Be prepared to leave quickly if necessary. Blackwood won't take your rejection lightly, especially after your reference to the mine supports. He now knows you possess damaging information. The implications of this assessment weren't lost on Nora. You think we're in danger? Sullivan hesitated, clearly weighing honesty against alarm. I think Blackwood has proven willing to eliminate obstacles to his plans, he said carefully with a glance at Jacob. It would be prudent to take precautions. The unspoken warning hung in the air between them. The same accident that had claimed Samuel's life might be arranged for his widow and son if they threatened Blackwood's interests. We'll be ready, Nora promised, her hand finding Jacob's shoulder and squeezing reassuringly. How will we know if you've succeeded? When will you return? By tomorrow evening at the latest, Sullivan said. If I haven't returned by then? He didn't need to complete the thought. If he hadn't returned, either his mission had failed or something had prevented his return altogether. Neither option boded well for their situation. As Sullivan prepared to depart, gathering the documents and checking his supplies, Jacob approached him with unexpected solemnity. Mr. Sullivan, he said, his young voice steady despite the uncertainty surrounding them. Thank you for helping us, for teaching me things, and for trying to make things right for Pa. The simple gratitude clearly touched Sullivan deeply. He placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. Your father would be proud of the young man you're becoming, he said softly. Remember what we've learned about leverage and force. Sometimes a small action applied at exactly the right point can move something much larger than itself. The lesson, ostensibly about physics, but clearly carrying deeper meaning, brought a small smile to Jacob's tear-stained face. I'll remember, he promised. With a final exchange of meaningful glances, with Nora conveying both determination and something more personal that neither was ready to name, Sullivan departed, his tall figure soon swallowed by the winter darkness. Left alone with her son, Nora faced the daunting task of preparing for all contingencies while maintaining a brave front. Well, she said with forced cheerfulness, shall we pack our adventure bags just in case? Jacob nodded, responding to her tone rather than the underlying gravity of the situation. Together they gathered essential clothing, keepsakes, and the small store of emergency funds Nora had managed to save over the past 2 years. By the time they finished, the kitchen table held 2 modest bundles ready for hasty departure if circumstances demanded. Where would we go? Jacob asked as they prepared for bed, the question revealing that he understood more of their predicament than Nora had realized. Martha Wheeler might take us in temporarily, Nora suggested, having already considered this possibility. Or we might head to Helena ourselves, where Mr. Sullivan has contacts who could help us. The vagueness of these plans underscored the precariousness of their situation, but Jacob seemed satisfied with the knowledge that options existed, however tentative. Despite the tension and uncertainty, exhaustion eventually claimed them both. Nora's last conscious thought before sleep overtook her was a prayer for Sullivan's safe journey and successful mission. Their future, perhaps even their lives, now depended on his ability to reach Helena and convince the federal marshal to intervene before Blackwood could implement his plans. Morning arrived with biting cold and clear skies, the storm having fully passed during the night. Nora woke at first light, momentarily disoriented by the knowledge that this day might bring either salvation or disaster. She dressed quickly and moved to the window, half expecting to see Blackwood's sleigh already approaching, with foreclosure papers in hand. The landscape remained peaceful, however unmarked by human presence, save for the tracks Sullivan's horse had left the previous evening. The temporary reprieve allowed Nora to complete morning chores with Jacob, both of them taking comfort in the familiar routine despite the uncertainty hanging over them. "Do you think Mr. Sullivan made it to Helena?" Jacob asked as they fed the livestock, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm sure he did," Nora assured him, projecting more confidence than she felt. "Mr. Sullivan is very resourceful." As they returned to the house, the distant sound of sleigh bells announced an approaching visitor. Nora's heart raced with apprehension, but it was Martha Wheeler's familiar blue wagon that appeared around the bend, not Blackwood's more elegant conveyance. "Martha," Nora greeted her with genuine relief as the older woman pulled up to the house. "I wasn't expecting you in these conditions." Martha dismounted with her usual spry efficiency despite her age. "Thought you might appreciate some company today," she said meaningfully, "especially after yesterday's visitors." News traveled quickly in Ruby Creek even during winter storms. "You heard about Blackwood's proposal," Nora surmised, ushering her friend inside. "And your refusal," Martha confirmed once they were settled in the kitchen, "caused quite a stir in town." Florence Jenkins had already prepared her home for the reception, nearly collapsed with indignation when word came there would be no wedding. Despite the gravity of their situation, Nora couldn't suppress a small smile at this image. "I'm afraid I disappointed many expectations yesterday." "Good," Martha declared firmly. "This town could use more disappointed expectations and fewer fulfilled ones, particularly where Garrett Blackwood is concerned." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, although they were alone in the house, Jacob having returned to the barn to check on a pregnant cow. "Word is he's furious. Spent half the night at the bank with his attorneys preparing paperwork." The confirmation of Blackwood's immediate action sent a chill through Nora. "The foreclosure," she murmured. Martha nodded grimly. "Set to be filed this morning. But that's not why I'm here." She reached into her coat and withdrew a crumpled telegram. "This came for Daniel Sullivan late last night. The operator is my second cousin's boy, knows I sometimes relay messages to certain parties." Nora accepted the telegram with trembling fingers, recognizing its potential importance. The message was brief but electric in its implications. "Deed filed as family homestead. Trust stop. Wife and child. Protected beneficiaries. Stop. Cannot be foreclosed or transferred without court approval. Stop. Original documents held in Denver. First National Bank. Stop. Brother departing with copies today. Stop. Samuel did protect us," Nora breathed, reading the message a second time to ensure she hadn't misunderstood. "He established a trust that prevents foreclosure without court approval." Martha's weathered face broke into a satisfied smile. "That husband of yours was smarter than Blackwood gave him credit for. The question now is whether this information reached Sullivan in time for him to act on it." The telegram had been addressed to Sullivan at a location in Helena, the federal marshal's office, Nora presumed. But had he arrived safely? Had he been able to present their evidence and secure the injunction they needed? Blackwood doesn't know about this yet. Nora realized possibilities suddenly expanding in her mind. If he attempts to file foreclosure papers without acknowledging the trust arrangement, he'd be committing fraud, which would strengthen any case against him. Martha agreed, following her reasoning, but it also means he's operating with incomplete information, which makes him potentially more dangerous. The implications sobered Nora immediately. A cornered predator was the most dangerous kind, and Blackwood, if confronted with legal obstacles he hadn't anticipated, might resort to more direct methods of removing threats to his plans. "We should leave," she said decisively, rising from her chair. "At least until Sullivan returns with news from Helena. Jacob and I packed essentials last night. We could go with you now." Martha shook her head slowly. "Roads to my place are watched," she said. "Have been since yesterday evening. Blackwood's men presumably making sure you don't escape before he can serve his papers." She patted Nora's hand reassuringly. "But I didn't come empty-handed." From beneath her heavy winter coat, Martha produced a revolver, small but undoubtedly lethal, its metal surface gleaming dully in the morning light. George's service revolver, she explained, referring to her late husband. Kept it cleaned and loaded all these years, though I've never had cause to use it. Today seems like an appropriate occasion to pass it along. Nora stared at the weapon, both attracted and repelled by its deadly purpose. She had fired rifles before Samuel had insisted she learn basic marksmanship for protection during his absences, but never with the intention of harming another human being. I pray it won't be necessary, Martha said softly, correctly interpreting her hesitation. But a woman alone must sometimes make difficult choices to protect what's hers. She demonstrated the revolver's action with practiced hands. Simple to operate, point and squeeze. All 5 chambers are loaded. With reluctant determination, Nora accepted the weapon, its weight surprisingly substantial for its size. Thank you, Martha. I hope I won't need it, but hope makes a poor shield against men like Blackwood, Martha finished grimly. Keep it close, Nora, and don't hesitate if the moment comes. The conversation was interrupted by Jacob's return, his cheeks red from the cold, but his expression excited. Daisy's getting really close to calving, he announced. I think it might be today or tomorrow. The mundane miracle of impending birth seemed incongruously normal against the backdrop of their current crisis. Yet Nora found herself grateful for the reminder that life continued its cycles regardless of human schemes and conflicts. That's wonderful news, she said quickly, concealing the revolver in her apron pocket before Jacob could notice it. We'll need to check on her regularly today. Martha rose, recognizing her cue to depart before her presence could be noted by any observers Blackwood might have stationed nearby. I should be getting back, she said, but I'll spread word in town about your expected calf. Might draw some attention away from other matters. The strategic thinking behind this suggestion impressed Nora. Martha was creating a plausible reason for people to visit the Haywood Ranch in the coming hours, potential witnesses whose presence might deter any drastic action Blackwood might be contemplating. After Martha's departure, the day stretched interminably, each hour marked by increasing tension as Nora alternated between caring for the pregnant cow, keeping Jacob occupied with indoor tasks, and watching the road for any approach. The revolver remained in her apron pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the potential danger they faced. By mid-afternoon, with still no sign of either Sullivan returning from Helena or Blackwood arriving with foreclosure papers, Nora's nerves were stretched to breaking point. The waiting, she decided, was almost worse than confrontation would be. Ma, Jacob said, suddenly looking up from the book he'd been pretending to read for the past hour. Someone's coming. Nora moved quickly to the window, her hand instinctively closing around the revolver in her pocket. 2 sleighs were indeed approaching Blackwood's distinctive conveyance in the lead, followed by what appeared to be Sheriff Morgan's more utilitarian vehicle. Jacob, she said, keeping her voice calm, despite the fear clutching at her throat. I need you to go to the barn and stay with Daisy. Check if she needs anything and don't come back to the house until I call for you. Can you do that? The boy's expression revealed that he understood the gravity of the situation despite her attempt at normalcy. Is it Mr. Blackwood? Is he going to try to take our home? I'm going to handle this, Nora assured him, not directly answering his question. But I need to know you're safe in the barn while I do. Jacob hesitated, clearly torn between obedience and concern for his mother. Take Pa's rifle, he suggested finally. It's still loaded from when you scared off that wolf last month. The fact that her 10-year-old son was suggesting armed defense spoke volumes about how much he had absorbed of their precarious situation. I'll be fine, Nora promised, ushering him toward the back door. Go now quickly. Once Jacob was safely away, Nora retrieved Samuel's rifle from its place above the fireplace, checking that it was indeed loaded as her son had claimed. She positioned it near the door, out of immediate sight, but within easy reach if needed. The revolver remained in her pocket, a final line of defense she prayed would not be necessary. Blackwood's sleigh stopped at her front gate, and the banker emerged with the same precise movements that characterized all his actions. Sheriff Morgan followed from the second sleigh, along with Blackwood's attorney and another man Nora didn't recognize, heavily built, with the hard expression of someone accustomed to intimidation rather than negotiation. Nora opened the door before they could knock, standing squarely in the entrance, with one hand remaining in her pocket closed around Martha's revolver. Mr. Blackwood, she acknowledged coolly. Sheriff Morgan, I assume you're here on official business. Blackwood's smile was entirely devoid of warmth. Indeed, Mrs. Haywood. I have the foreclosure documents here ready for immediate execution. He patted the portfolio his attorney carried. Given your reluctance to accept more favorable terms yesterday, I'm afraid this is the only remaining option. Sheriff Morgan looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the snow. Mrs. Haywood, he began apologetically, I'm here in an official capacity to witness the service of these papers and to facilitate the transfer of property if necessary. The implication was clear. If Nora resisted, the sheriff was prepared to remove her by force if required. The presence of the unknown man, clearly hired muscle rather than legal representation, underscored the threat. Before you proceed, Nora said carefully, there's information you should be aware of regarding the legal status of this property. Blackwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The bank holds the mortgage, Mrs. Haywood. The legal status is quite clear. Your payments are delinquent, and foreclosure is the prescribed remedy. Except, Nora countered, drawing strength from the knowledge contained in the telegram, that this property was filed as a family homestead trust by my late husband. As his wife and the mother of his child, I am a protected beneficiary. The deed cannot be foreclosed or transferred without court approval. The effect of this statement was immediate and dramatic. Blackwood's face flushed with anger while his attorney frowned and began rifling through his papers with evident concern. That's preposterous, Blackwood snapped. There is no such trust arrangement on file with the county. Because it was filed in Denver, Nora replied, the confidence in her voice growing with each word. At First National Bank, where Samuel's father is currently retrieving certified copies to present to the relevant authorities. Sheriff Morgan looked between them, confusion evident on his weathered face. Mr. Blackwood, if there's a valid trust in place, we can't legally proceed with foreclosure without court review. There is no trust. Blackwood's composure cracked completely, his voice rising in frustration. This is a desperate fabrication to delay the inevitable. Then you won't mind waiting for verification from Denver, Nora suggested calmly. If I'm lying, a few days' delay won't change the outcome. If I'm telling the truth, proceeding now would constitute fraud. The attorney tugged urgently at Blackwood's sleeve, whispering something that caused the banker's expression to darken further. After a tense conference, too quiet for Nora to overhear, the attorney addressed Sheriff Morgan directly. In light of this unexpected claim, we should perhaps postpone the formal filing until the alleged trust documentation can be reviewed, he suggested diplomatically. A prudent legal precaution. Sheriff Morgan nodded, visibly relieved at this resolution. Seems sensible to me. No harm in waiting to ensure everything's proper and legal-like. Blackwood's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. This changes nothing, he hissed at Nora. Trust or no trust, you cannot maintain this property alone. You'll be forced to sell eventually, and when that happens— Mr. Blackwood, the sheriff interrupted firmly, I believe we've concluded our official business for today. Best we return to town before the light fails. For a moment, Nora thought Blackwood might defy even the sheriff's authority in his fury. But the banker's self-control reasserted itself with visible effort. He straightened his coat, his face settling into cold calculation once more. Of course, Sheriff, another day makes little difference in the larger scheme. He fixed Nora with a penetrating stare. We'll return when the matter of this supposed trust is clarified. I suggest you use the intervening time to consider your increasingly limited options. As the men turned to leave, a new sound broke the tension, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of town. All eyes turned to see Daniel Sullivan galloping toward them, his horse pushing through the snow with urgent purpose. Blackwood's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, calculation tinged with apprehension. Your simple friend returns, he observed coldly. How convenient. Sullivan reined in his horse sharply upon seeing the gathered men, his gaze quickly finding Nora's with an unspoken question. She gave a small nod, indicating that she was unharmed, and the situation, while tense, had not escalated to violence. Mr. Sullivan, Sheriff Morgan greeted him with evident relief, perhaps welcoming another party to dilute the dangerous tension between Nora and Blackwood. Quite a day for traveling. The Sullivan dismounted, his movements more fluid and assured than in his simple persona, though he maintained the appearance of deference as he removed his hat. Sheriff, he acknowledged. Mr. Blackwood. We were just concluding some business with Mrs. Haywood, Blackwood said smoothly, studying Sullivan with narrowed eyes. A matter of property ownership and outstanding debts. Interesting, Sullivan replied, his voice deliberately measured, but no longer halting or uncertain. I've just come from Helena with some documents that might be relevant to that very matter. He reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking envelope bearing federal seals. This is an injunction from Federal Marshal Collins temporarily halting any property transfers or foreclosure proceedings involving the Haywood Ranch pending investigation of certain irregularities. Sheriff Morgan accepted the document with obvious surprise, scanning its contents quickly. This appears to be in order, he confirmed, looking up with new respect at Sullivan. Signed by the federal marshal himself. What irregularities? Blackwood demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. What investigation? Sullivan met his gaze directly, all pretense of simplicity abandoned. An investigation into railroad land acquisition practices throughout the territory, he said clearly. Specifically instances where safety regulations may have been violated to increase profitability of properties along proposed routes. The implication hung in the air like gunsmoke: Samuel's death, the substandard support beams, Blackwood's determined efforts to acquire the Haywood property, all connected in a pattern of corruption that now faced federal scrutiny. This is absurd, Blackwood sputtered, though his complexion had paled noticeably. I know nothing about any safety violations or railroad routes. Then you have nothing to fear from the investigation, Sullivan replied with deceptive mildness. In the meantime, however, the injunction prevents any action regarding this property until Marshal Collins completes his review. Sheriff Morgan, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden legal complications, folded the injunction and tucked it into his coat. Well, that settles it for today, gentlemen. No foreclosure proceedings until this federal matter is resolved. He turned to Nora with an apologetic nod. Mrs. Haywood, I apologize for the disturbance. Good day to you. Blackwood remained frozen in place as the sheriff and the attorney returned to their respective sleighs. Only when the unknown hired man touched his arm questioningly did the banker seem to shake himself from his stunned immobility. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of absolute certainty. Not by any measure. Without waiting for a response, he turned sharply and stalked back to his sleigh, issuing curt instructions to his companions. Within moments, both vehicles were heading back toward town, leaving Nora and Sullivan standing in the snowy yard. As soon as they were out of earshot, Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You made it to Helena, she said, relief evident in her voice, and found the marshal. Sullivan nodded, a tired smile breaking through his serious expression. Barely. The roads were nearly impassable in places. But Marshal Collins was receptive, especially when I revealed my true identity. Your true, Nora began, then, understanding dawned. You told him you're Judge Sullivan. I had to, Sullivan confirmed. The evidence alone might not have been sufficient for an immediate injunction, but the testimony of a federal judge, even one in hiding, carries considerable weight. The significance of this revelation wasn't lost on Nora. You've sacrificed your anonymity, she said softly. After 3 years of hiding, you've exposed yourself to the very people who tried to kill you. Sullivan's expression was resolute rather than regretful. Some things are worth the risk, he said simply. Before Nora could respond, Jacob burst from the barn, having apparently been watching from a distance. Mr. Sullivan, he called, running toward them through the snow. You came back. Did you stop the bad men from taking our home? Sullivan knelt to meet the boy at eye level, his smile widening. For now, he confirmed, thanks to your father's careful planning and some help from a federal marshal in Helena. Jacob's face shone with pride and relief. I knew you'd help us, he declared with childish certainty. Ma said you were resourceful. Did she now? Sullivan glanced up at Nora, a warmth in his eyes that had nothing to do with their victory over Blackwood. Your mother is quite resourceful herself. I heard in town that she faced down Blackwood and his men without any help from me. I had Martha's revolver, Nora admitted, patting her pocket where the weapon still rested, and Samuel's rifle by the door. But I'm very glad I didn't have to use either. Daisy's having her calf, Jacob exclaimed suddenly, the rapid shifts in attention typical of his age. I was watching her when I saw you all arguing. She's really close now. The impending birth provided a welcome focus after the tension of the confrontation. Together they headed to the barn, where the cow was indeed in the early stages of labor. For the next few hours, their attention was fully absorbed by this natural miracle, Jacob asking endless questions, Sullivan providing patient, knowledgeable answers, Nora observing them both with a heart full of complicated emotions. By early evening, a healthy calf had joined their small herd, its wobbly legs and curious eyes drawing delighted laughter from Jacob. As the boy fussed over the newborn under Sullivan's watchful guidance, Nora found herself contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought them to this moment. A federal judge hiding as a simple laborer, a widow fighting to save her home, a boy witnessing both birth and the potential death of his security on the same winter day, and connecting them all the legacy of Samuel Haywood, his integrity, his foresight, his determination to protect his family even beyond death. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, when Sullivan joined her near the barn door, leaving Jacob contentedly arranging fresh straw for the mother and calf. Sullivan's expression grew serious once more. "Marshal Collins will arrive tomorrow with deputies to begin formal interviews. The injunction protects your property indefinitely, but the larger investigation into Blackwood's activities and the railroad corruption will take time." And the danger, Nora pressed, knowing that legal protections were one thing but physical safety quite another. "Remain owns," Sullivan acknowledged grimly. "Blackwood has too much at stake to simply accept defeat. Until he's formally charged and detained, you and Jacob should exercise extreme caution." The warning confirmed Nora's own assessment. Today's victory, while significant, had merely transformed an immediate threat into a more subtle, lingering one. "And you," she asked, "now that your identity is known to the authorities, what will you do?" Sullivan was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to where Jacob knelt beside the new calf, whispering encouragement to the unsteady creature. "Marshal Collins has asked me to formally rejoin the investigation," he said finally, "to provide testimony and legal expertise as they build cases against the entire network." "You're leaving then," Nora concluded, trying to keep disappointment from coloring her voice. It was the logical next step, Sullivan returning to his rightful position in the legal system, using his knowledge and authority to ensure justice on a larger scale than would be possible in his simple persona. "Not necessarily," Sullivan replied, surprising her. "The investigation will be headquartered in Helena initially, but much of the evidence collection will happen here in communities affected by the corruption." He turned to face her directly. "Including Ruby Creek." Hope flickered in Nora's chest, tempered by practical considerations. "But you can't return to your previous life here," she pointed out. "The pretense of being simple Sullivan is over." "True," he agreed with a small smile. "But perhaps it's the time for Ruby Creek to meet the real Daniel Sullivan, a man with legal training who's chosen to live more simply without the pretense of limited capacity." The possibility of Sullivan remaining in their lives not as an occasional visitor or temporary ally, but as a permanent presence sent a warmth through Nora that had nothing to do with the shelter of the barn. "Jacob would like that," she said carefully, testing the waters of this unspoken possibility between them. "He's learned so much from you already." Sullivan's eyes held hers steadily. "And you, Nora, would you welcome my continued presence once this danger has passed?" The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. "Yes," she said simply, "for many reasons, not least of which is that you've reminded me what it's like to have someone to share burdens with, to not face every challenge alone." Something in Sullivan's expression softened at her words. He reached out slowly, giving her ample opportunity to withdraw, and took her hand in his larger one. "I've been alone for 3 years," he said quietly, "hiding not just my identity, but my true self from everyone around me. These past weeks teaching Jacob, helping you with the ranch, facing this threat together, they've reminded me what it means to be part of something larger than myself." The confession delivered with such simple honesty touched Nora deeply. "We make a good team." She offered her own feelings, still too new and fragile for more definitive expression. "We do," Sullivan agreed, his thumb tracing a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "And whatever happens with Blackwood in the investigation, I'd like to see what kind of team we might become, given time and opportunity." Before Nora could respond, Jacob called excitedly from across the barn. "Ma, Mr. Sullivan, the calf is standing up." The moment between them paused but didn't break as they turned together to witness this small triumph of new life. Sullivan didn't release her hand as they crossed the barn to join Jacob and Nora, found she had no desire for him to do so. The future remained uncertain in many ways. Blackwood still posed a threat. The investigation would undoubtedly bring complications and potentially danger, and the practical challenges of maintaining the ranch hadn't disappeared with the injunction against foreclosure. Yet as they stood together watching Jacob guide the wobbly calf in its first steps, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. Not just hope for survival, but anticipation of joy. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them not as isolated individuals, but as a unit, their strengths and weaknesses complementing each other in the shared purpose of building something meaningful together. "I'm thinking of naming her Phoenix," Jacob announced, stroking the calf's white-marked forehead. "Mr. Sullivan told me about the bird that rises from ashes to live again." "That seems right, doesn't it?" For today, Sullivan and Nora exchanged glances, the symbolism not lost on either of them. "It seems perfect," Nora agreed, squeezing Sullivan's hand gently. "A very fitting name for new beginnings." Outside, the winter sun set over Ruby Creek, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the barn, warmed by animals and shared purpose, three people and a newborn calf formed the nucleus of something not yet defined, but full of promise, a family of choice rather than circumstance, bound by mutual respect and growing affection rather than social expectation or financial necessity. As darkness fell, they moved together toward the house, Sullivan's hand at the small of Nora's back, Jacob leading the way with a lantern held high against the gathering night. The path ahead remained challenging, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Nora Haywood walked it with the certainty that she wasn't walking alone. In the distance, the lights of Ruby Creek twinkled against the darkening sky, a community that would soon face its own reckoning with corruption and justice. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight belonged to quieter victories, a home preserved, a child reassured, a connection acknowledged between two people who had each survived loss and isolation to find unexpected companionship in each other. And in that moment, it was enough.